It was that time of year again, the time when the air gets a little crisper. The nights make me a little more thankful for the fur coat I wear, and the lady begins to look over her shoulder a little more often. This year, we had decided to nip it in the bud and had begun making our preparations early. "It is unlikely that he will attack 2 years in a row," the lady had said, "but this is no reason not to be on our toes. Just because he does not come himself doesn't mean there may not be attackers. We will be on our guard, and we won't be caught wanting again." What this translated to mostly was the annual pumpkin patch. The lady had 2 kinds of pumpkin patches this year, cut and uncut. Some guests liked to cut their own, as the weekly carving contest could attest, but others wanted a carved pumpkin without any of the muss or fuss. The lady had a pretty large supply of energy these days, thanks, in part, to the regular supplies of Stragview, so she found it easy to manipulate the soil in new and interesting ways. The rows of pumpkins came out looking absolutely ghastly, and the patrons loved them. "The lady has strived for innovation before," Tobias remarked as we walked amongst the rows, inspecting the gourds for defects, "but I don't believe she has ever had this steady a stream of sacrifices. Not since the days of the Saturnine and the riot has she found mortals ready to give themselves to her, and it shows in her work." "Does it make a difference?" I asked, and Tobias laughed in his throat. "But of course, a meal that does not struggle, that does not fight, is a meal of pure energy. So many of those she lures in fight her tooth and nail, but these convicted ones seem almost gleeful to be free of this prison, even if freedom leads to their death. I don't know what goes on in this Stragview, but it must be a wicked place indeed." "You ain't got a clue," came a gruff voice from the row ahead of us. I looked up to see Randy approaching us, his hand resting on the wooden handle of his club. Randy had been in a foul mood lately, and it was no mystery why. He didn't like the sacrifices, he didn't like the work squads, and he didn't like having the warden anywhere near the garden. He wouldn't talk about his time at Stragview, no matter how I asked, and the added security seemed to only be making his mood darker. "Randall, you've been inside the prison. Is it truly so terrible?" Tobias asked, clearly not reading the room. "Pray you never have to go there. It's like living in a storm cloud. You don't ever think the sun will shine again, and all the rain does is fall on your back and bend your spine. I wasn't there long, but it was longer than I wanted to be. There's a darkness there. I can still remember it, and I feel it creeping into here, too." There was a weird, squelchy noise, and Tobias and I stepped back as one of the pumpkins opened its fanged mouth and tried to bite at Randy. It was just a pumpkin. The teeth were no more than mushy gourd, but the idea of being bitten by anything didn't sit well with me. It must have not sat well with Randy either, because his cudgel came down like he'd just been waiting for an opportunity and smashed the pumpkin into a pulp. He glowered down at the mess, wiping his weapon across his leg before putting it away. "That one was clearly defective," he growled, walking off towards the next row, keeping his head low and his eyes on the pumpkins. As creepy as they were, we had been told they were instrumental in keeping the Green Man away. I don't know why, something to do with his early days in this realm, but the Green Man cannot stand the jack-o'-lanterns. I believe the people who were first subjugated by him discovered this and used it to keep him away, and it's a feud he has retained through time. He destroys them whenever he can, corrupts them when he is able, and he never seems free of them. It's one of the few weapons that we have against him, and it's a weapon that we will use. From August to December, the park was always covered in jack-o'-lanterns. Try as we might, it was impossible to keep them in the colder weather, but we grew pumpkins in our greenhouse year-round. The lady could alter the weather, make it summer in the dead of winter, but the pumpkins couldn't last forever, and the green man seemed to enjoy destroying them through proxies. I remember well the pumpkin head that we'd had last year during the battle, and remained vigilant against their incursion again. It was nearly fall, a time of shift for us, and we might soon find ourselves under attack again. The threat of attack seemed to be taking a toll on the lady as well. She seemed fitful, unsure of herself, filled with a short-tempered sort of energy. I'd seen people overuse caffeine supplements that seemed to have less energy than her, and she flew from one thing to another with wild abandon. This time of year, it was normal to see her slow down a little and begin to lose some of her energy as the seasons changed. But this year, her mind buzzed like a beehive. The cut pumpkins are coming along nicely, the corn maze will prove to be better than last year's, and the transplants from the Whispering Forest will make for a truly spooky haunted trail this year. I need more, though. I want to truly let the people know that the gardens are here for this town and thankful for their patronage and sometimes for their sacrifice. Tell me, what else is required for Halloween? I know the tricks and the treating, the candy, the costumes, the trappings, but what else could we do? She asked me this on one of our nightly walks, and it never ceased to amaze me how seriously she took the holidays. War be damned. The lady, despite the danger, loved the holidays that took place during her enemy's time of strength. She loved Christmas, Thanksgiving, and Halloween most of all. Well, sometimes at Halloween parties, people bob for apples. How does one bob for an apple? She asked, mystified. Well, like with your mouth, I said, putting my hands behind my back and dipping my head as I mimed dipping for apples. She nodded, seeming to understand. What else? She asked, leaning in close enough to make me blush a little. Well, my mom always liked candy corn, but I think she was the only one who did. Her face scrunched a little. Candy corn. How can something be candy and corn? I laughed. It can't, not really. It's like wax candy, kinda. It's not really candy or corn. Mom also used to make corn balls as well, something she really liked. Ooh, and candied apples too. When I was a kid, she used to make and hand them out, along with all other kinds of homemade treats, so she could give them to the kids. The lady thought about this for a moment, contemplating it as we walked. It was always strange to discover the holes in her knowledge, but I could see her putting the pieces together, some of them not fitting as neatly as she would have liked them to. It was strange to see the child and the woman at war within her, and when she seized my hand, I jumped a little in surprise. Come, I need some references for these things you speak of. Randy blinked at her as she stood before him, not quite sure that he had heard her correctly. You want a what? I wish to investigate some of these delicacies that your second has told me of. I need you and him to escort me to a place where I might find them, post-haste. Randy looked at me, clearly flustered, and grabbed the keys to his Jeep off the peg. Only one place I can think of where we could find them this time of night, he said. And that's how we found ourselves at Walmart at 11 till midnight. The greeter blinked at us a few times as we walked in, clearly not used to elegantly dressed women coming in at this time of night with an escort, and Randy looked around anxiously as we strode into the harshly lit halls of consumerism. I don't like this, he growled, the canvas coat he'd worn bulging with the shape of his cudgel, his .38 in the opposite pocket. It's too open. If he decides to attack you, we'll have a time getting away. Pish-posh, the lady said, flapping a hand at him. If he wishes to attack me, then he won't do it here, and not until closer to solstice. His power is still small, and we have weeks yet before he will be great enough to move. Now I wish to see this corned candy you speak of." "A candy corn," I corrected, and we made our way to the aisle that had already been set aside for Halloween candy. It was barely August, but Walmart had already set aside an entire double aisle for confections. It was a little weird to be here, knowing what I knew about the town. Walmart stood as an anchor of normalcy in this place, a landmark of everyday life in a town of demons, plural, eldritch deities, magicians who did a little more than parlor tricks, and all the other crazy shit that seems to exist inside or near its borders. Whether the retail giant was aware of the strangeness or not didn't seem to matter. It was happy to take our money and keep our secrets. Her eyes lit up as she saw the assembled treats, and soon our buggy was full of peanut butter cups, various small candy bars, and other assorted candies. She found the candy corn and, to my surprise, corn balls. The candied apples took a little longer to find. They were in produce for some reason, but they had caramel apples too, so that gave us some variety. I made the mistake of mentioning these little ghosts my mom made out of marshmallows after that, which led to s'mores, which led us to go find everything for those as well. The employees probably thought we were crazy as we dragged all that up to the register at 1:20 in the morning, the whole buggy coming to about $120. And as we rode back to the park, the lady in the back seat with her purchases, Randy shook his head at me. "You know you've created a monster, right? There's no telling what will come of this." Watching her in the back seat, as she took in all the splendor, I thought it might be worth the trouble. Any amount of stress, I thought at that moment, would be worth seeing her smile. Grandpa was sitting on the back porch, the 12-pack I had bought, looking decidedly emptier. Glimmer had stopped by for a bit, wanting to see me and tell me about the wedding plans, before going off to hunt to fulfill her duty as the first hunter. Grandpa had been patient, but it appeared he had definitely started without me. "Geez, Gramps, are there any left?" He laughed, holding the empty by the neck before tossing it into the woods, where I heard it shatter against a tree. "Of course, I left you 6. This is only my 3rd, or is it my 4th? I shook my head. "Gramps, why do you do that?" "Do what?" he asked, taking a sip from the 3rd or 4th and smacking his lips. "Toss the bottles into the woods like that. Can't be good for nature, and you and I tromp around out there too often for you to be littering glass everywhere." He cackled like I'd said the funniest thing ever. "Son, have you ever found so much as a shard of glass out there?" "I suppose I haven't," I said, thinking about it. "And you never will. The broken bottles are my gift to the fairies, and they love them very much." I was speechless for a moment. "The fairies?" "Mm-hmm. You break bottles in the woods for the fairies." I tell you, my friend turned into a tree. We fought a creature made of bones, and you're preparing to marry a gorgeous half-fey woman. But that is where you draw the line." I shrugged. I think it's easier to just assume you like the sound they make when they hit the trees. Grandpa scoffed. "It is pretty satisfying. That's why I started doing it. That and your great-grandfather. But no, I kept doing it because of the little people. At least, after they showed themselves. I'm a friend of the Fae, you know. They hold me in high regard, and all because I smashed some bottles on the edge of my property." "Well," I said, popping the top on my first, "this I gotta hear." Grandpa laughed. "It was a warm night, just like this one. I was sitting on this very porch when I was suddenly summoned to the court of the fairies." I knew of the Fae, of course. Grandma had told me a lot about 'em, and I knew that they could be tricky and dangerous. I never caught lightning bugs, I never disturbed fairy rings, and if I felt like I was watched in the forest, I never stuck around. Grandma had always told me that the Fae were a wealth of information if they could be made to speak. This usually meant a bargain of some sort, but I had unwittingly built up a great deal of credit with these little creatures, and all by a little casual littering. My father, you see, your great-grandfather, had always tossed his cans and bottles into the tree line. It was a different age, and we didn't quite know what we were doing to our beautiful Appalachian countryside just yet. Dad and I would sit on the back porch sometimes, him with his glass or can of beer, and me with my Aussie cola, and tell stories or just talk about our day. As he finished, Dad would always yell, "Bombs away," and throw the can or bottle into the tree line. He would laugh and make it sound like a big joke, so I started doing it too. Now, much like you just realized, I started to notice that I never found any glass out there. Dad always tossed his garbage in the same place, and sometimes my mom, your great-grandmother, would make me go out there with a rake and clean up the mess. Well, I never did find any glass or cans out there, and I quickly learned to just busy around a bit and then dump the pine needles in the garbage, so she thought I'd found the glass. Her scolding never stopped him from doing it, and it was a habit I kept into adulthood. So, one evening, as I was sitting on the porch and making my way through a six-pack, something comes streaking out of the woods and lands on the railing of the porch. I managed to do two things before I saw what it was. The first being I fell over and spilled beer on myself, and the second being I pulled together a shield in front of me, just in case it was dangerous. What it was a small creature in a waistcoat, stockings, little pilgrim shoes, and a powdered wig. It looked like a kid's toy, some kind of French Revolution Barbie or something, and as I got back in my chair, it unrolled a little scroll, cleared its throat, and began to read in a voice like a bumblebee having a stroke. "Her Royal Highness, Lady Jezevina of the Rolling Forest, has extended to you, Sir Benefactor, an invitation to her royal gala tonight, to mark the completion of her royal palace and grand cathedral. What say you, Sir Benefactor?" he asked, looking past the scroll and seeming to realize I was sitting half in my chair and was very disheveled. "Are you quite well, sir? You seem to have soiled yourself." "I did no such thing," I shot back. "You scared me plumb to death, and I spilled beer on me. What's this all about, Sir Benefactor? I don't remember making a donation to no dang fairies." The little messenger looked up his nose at me and stamped his foot almost daintily as he responded, "Those of the Fey realm do not appreciate that word. Furthermore, you are the benefactor of the lady's court, whether you know it or not. She is holding a gala tonight and has asked for your attendance. This is quite an honor. Shall I tell her that you will attend?" I started to say no, but hell, how many chances do you get to go to a fairy party? "I suppose I will. Can you wait for me to put on something that doesn't smell like beer? I don't know the way." "Certainly," the little fella intoned. "I shall return in a quarter of an hour. Be here and ready to depart, please." Then he shot off into the woods, and I went back inside to get my things. Your grandma was sitting by the fire, reading one of those lady fantasy books with a half-naked fella on the cover, and looked up as I came in, smirking. "Did you get tired of listening to the woods already?" she asked, wrinkling her nose as she smelled the beer on me. "Jesus, Jack, you smell like a distillery. I thought you were going out to drink a beer, not wallow in it." "Never mind that," I said, smiling at her. "I've been invited to a fancy gala in about 15 minutes. You want to come with me?" Your grandma thought about it, finally nodding and putting her book away. "How fancy are we talking?" I thought about it. "Sunday social ought to be, but we gotta hurry. The guide said he would definitely leave us if we didn't." About 10 minutes later, we were both out on the porch in something sensible yet nice, and our guide was tapping his foot impatiently. "Follow me, if you please," he said, flying off slowly towards the woods. I don't have to tell you that your grandma was quite speechless. She had seen some weird things, the goat creature, some forest things, even Glimmer on one occasion, but she'd never seen a fairy. Heck, I had never seen a fairy either till that night, but when I offered her my arm, she came along. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked quietly, like she might offend him. "Sure looks like one," I whispered back. "Did you know they were real?" I just shook my head as she gingerly stepped into the tree line behind him. "I do hope you haven't been throwing beer bottles out here tonight. If I come down on glass and cut my foot, the only place we're likely to be going is the hospital." Your grandmother didn't think much of my bottle throwing either, but the thought of broken glass was soon the farthest thing from my mind. The deeper we went, the more our guide began to push the branches and roots aside. The ground smoothed as we passed, the trees bent away from our path, and I was pretty sure he made a couple of them get out of the way entirely. Your grandma took it all with rapt amazement, and I noticed her dress wasn't covered with hitchhikers or cockleburs, which I so often picked up on my hikes. I had chosen a button-up shirt, slacks, pairing them with some hiking boots, since I had figured on more strenuous circumstances. The animals never stilled at our passing, and as we went, I began to notice lights ahead. Soon those lights were around us too, and it was like 100,000 fireflies had taken up an honor guard around us. Those lights were the Fae, and I saw ball gowns and sequined attire that made us look downright drab. There was flowing hairdos as well, and luminescent wings like those on a dragonfly. It reminded me of a page I had seen in an old picture book when I was very young, The Gathering of Spring, and I expected to see Queen Mab or Queen Titania float by in a tiny carriage pulled by sparkling horses. They floated around us, showing deference I did not believe that we had earned. But it wasn't until we got closer to that dazzling light show up ahead that I began to cotton to the situation of my benefactordom. Our guide was approached by a chunky fella, but as I got closer, I realized it was Armor. He and his winged cohort were dressed in armor that had been fashioned from aluminum cans, cutting holes for their wings and limbs and smoothing them out a little bit so they weren't quite so ungainly. He threw me a salute, the little guy standing almost on my nose, and thanked me for my donation of materials for the squad's armor and weapons. Then I noticed it right there on his chest. It was a Pabst Blue Ribbon logo. These little fairies were wearing my old beer cans. "How many of your men have I outfitted, if you don't mind me asking?" I said curiously. "Sir, The lady recognizes you for outfitting her entire guard, all 120 of us, and another 50 of her retainers. You have been instrumental in our efforts to retake the southern berry patches from the centipedes and the hornets. This armor saved my life last year," he said, tapping a fist over a dent that had been repaired. "And whomever this pap is, he must be a fine smith." I had to stop myself from laughing, and your grandmother hid hers well. They flew off then, and your grandma bumped me on my shoulder. Well, I guess all that drinking helped out after all. I just thought you were the nicest alcoholic I had ever seen. I smiled. Guess that's why they invited us. Maybe they wanted to thank us for benefiting their war effort. I was in for a bigger surprise, however. As we came through a copse of trees and into a small clearing, I saw a large and impressive fey town that looked right out of a history book. They had been industrious, it seemed, because the streets were cobbled, the roofs were thatched, and most of the houses had windows. Just past the little town was a castle, and it was beautiful. It was made mostly of stone, but I saw a lot of glass and many colors at that. There were greens and browns and reds and blues, and some of them looked very familiar. The crowd of flying little folk had led us to a fair in progress near the outskirts, and that was where I met the Lady of the Fae. These were dewdrop fairies, I would later learn, but she remains one of the most beautiful creatures I have ever seen. Beside the fairground was a new cathedral, and the whole roof seemed to be made of glass. They had worked the broken edges into other broken edges, and the whole place looked like it would glimmer in the sun. I imagined it probably got a little warm, too, but I guess if that was what they wanted, then it was their cathedral to make. The spires were similarly worked, the windows looking like stained glass fit for any cathedral, and I laughed when it hit me. This was why they wanted to honor me. They had built this place with my unknowing help. "Ah, you came," said the little ruler. "I had hoped you would. For years we have been using your gifts to help our people, and we thought it was time you were thanked properly. Is this your wife that you bring before us? We are honored to meet her as well, and we wish both of you many happy years." She told me how the winters had been cruel to them, and their kingdom had been so drab. But then, one day, they began finding my offerings of glass and metal by the woodline. They had been angry at first, thinking it was trash or a trap for them. But soon they took those offerings and made them into glass for their windows, ornaments for their home, and outfitted their warriors for battle in the metal I left behind. Such wondrous metal! We Fae do not tolerate iron, but this metal did not burn us. So we took it and worked it, and it protects our warriors from thorns and stings and the weapons of our enemies. We have grown and become stronger because of you, and we want to thank you for your generosity." That night, they named me a Fae friend, and I promised to keep leaving my gifts by the tree line for them. And so that's how I became a fairy friend, and why I toss my bottles and cans by the wood line to this very day. I laughed as he finished. I couldn't help myself. Are you saying that the fairies take all the broken glass and old beer bottles away and thank you for it?" Grandpa nodded. To this very day, I get thank you gifts from time to time. I have a very smart letter opener that they left on the porch once, and a bottle of pure honey they collected for me one year. I have been invited back a few times, but it gets harder to make it all the way each time, and I have sent my polite refusal the last few times. He got up slowly, wobbling a little. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think it's time I went to get my next offering to the little folks. I smiled, shaking my head as he went inside. Grandpa was full of surprises. It wasn't until I heard a small crash from inside that I realized my night wasn't as peaceful as I had believed. I went running back in, but by then it was too late to do much more than call an ambulance. Grandpa had fallen down, and it looked like he was going to need more than a hand up this time. Lunch that day looked more like a war council. Rebecca was used to a big group around the kids that Gerald usually watched, but it took her a minute to realize that he was with them today. This explained where he'd been for the rest of the morning, she supposed, and he glanced up as she started to walk by with her pizza. She had intended to go sit in their usual place, not wanting to spoil his chances of getting into the little gang they had there, but Gerald called her name and waved her over before she could escape. "This is Rebecca," he said, as she squeezed into the offered chair. "She's a friend of mine." "The more the merrier," one of the kids said, and she thought his name might be Dunstan. He was in their class, but he usually went off with her least favorite doctor for private lessons, so she didn't often get to work with him. "This is Dex, Masha, Ginny, Brittany, Heather, Daniel, and Ryan. And I'm Dunstan," he said, bringing her up to speed on those assembled. "Gerald, our newest friend here, besides you, was just telling us something very interesting," he said, clapping Gerald on the back as he grinned at him. Gerald accepted it, though his returning grin was a little wooden. "I told them that Chandra was responsible for the nightmares that Masha had been waking up with lately." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? How did you come by that information?" "I happened upon a conversation I probably wasn't supposed to hear while we were in the library," he said, glancing at Brittany and Ginny, "though I didn't know between who until now." Both girls looked a little ashamed, Ginny shaking her head. "We didn't know that was what she was talking about. We just assumed that she would get over it and come be friends with everyone." "Chandra isn't the making friends type, it would appear," Dex said, fingers steepled before his face. "The question is, what do we do about it?" "We could tell Mrs. Cashmere," Ginny started, but Masha shook her head immediately. "I get the feeling this sort of thing isn't punished. If I'm too weak to sense that she's the one giving me nightmares, then I deserve what I get. No, I think we have to handle this on our own." "How do we even know that it's actually Chandra anyway?" Heather asked, looking at Gerald distrustfully. "Maybe this guy is just playing games or something. We don't have any proof. Only he heard what she said after Britt and Jenny left." "That's true," Daniel said. "We just have your word, Gerald. I don't want to condemn someone on just the word of—" "The red stuff," Heather said suddenly, thinking she understood what the visions had been trying to show her. She suddenly had the attention of the whole table, and it made her wish that she'd just kept her mouth shut. "I get visions. It's my power. Dunstan, you remember, I told you guys on the first day of class that I had visions about things that may happen." Dunstan was nodding, and she was glad. She didn't dare ask Gerald if he remembered, because that would ruin her credibility. They were suspicious of him, so if she wanted to convince them of what she believed, she would have to go in alone. "Well, I've been having these weird dreams where I wander the kindergarten by night, and last night I heard Masha as she began to scream. I floated back in, and she had a crown made of red neon around her head. I guess maybe that was the nightmare, but it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before." A few of them were nodding, but Daniel was clearly unmoved. You'll excuse me if I don't just take your word for it. I want Masha to get some sleep too. I want all of us to get some sleep, but we can't just go around lobbing accusations, no matter how unpleasant the target is. Seems there's really only one thing to do, Masha said, looking unhappy about it, but resolved. I'll have to meet her there. Meet her where? Dex said, not sure what she was talking about. In my dreams. Now that I know she's attacking me, I can plan for it and set up defenses. If it's just dreams, then the defenses won't work, but if it's her, then she might have a nasty surprise tonight. The bell rang for afternoon classes, and they headed out, Dunstan moving easily into the trio of Rebecca and Gerald. It appeared that they had been accepted into the group, and as Dunstan and Gerald began to talk about something as normal as video games, Rebecca had to hold in the urge to say that she had told him so. He could have been part of this much earlier, but she supposed his strings had known something that he hadn't. They were running the obstacle course again, and it still took a lot of focus to pull it off, especially as tired as he was. The kindergarten's version of an obstacle course was 3 parts Ninja Warrior, 3 parts 90s game show, and 3 parts military training. The last part was a dash of masochism that seemed to hang around most of the red band training. Maybe that was Cutter's special edition, but whatever it was or wasn't, Dex knew 2 things. 1, that he was tired, and 2, that he was still making the other guys look like crap. Dex was pretty used to pouring it on and outrunning the police. You didn't last long on the streets if you couldn't dodge the law when the chips were down, and Dex had lasted longer than most. He had never used the brain blast on a cop. That was a great way to get a serious APB out on you, but he made it a point to know escape routes in an area he was going to stay in long term. They had never raided the clubhouse, but he was sure it was only a matter of time. The wall was nothing more than another chain-link fence to scale. The pit was just rooftops to jump between. The sandbags were pedestrians and bike messengers. The reflex board, the hurdles, the narrow alleys, they were all just one more part of his daily escape from pursuit. Dex glanced around, smiling as he watched Dick fall off the moving platform for about the 3rd time. For someone who claimed to have been a state champion, he was clearly struggling to get through the course. Dex had started out close to Ryan, trying to help the kid out, but Ryan had told him after a few slips that he wanted to do it himself. So, Dex had left him behind, and as he crossed the endpoint, he looked back to see that Ryan was a little ahead of Dick and his cohorts, but not by much. It's always wild to watch you run the course, kid, Cutter said, coming up behind him to watch the others. How do you do it so fast? Most of the kids we grab off the street are malnourished or barely capable of running. You move like we stole you from a junior ROTC event. Dex just shrugged. The fact that you guys took me off the streets and not from police custody or a halfway house should tell you everything you need to know. It was weird, Dex knew, to talk about getting snatched off the street like that, but after a while it was probably easier than being mad about it. It was so normal around here, in fact, that many of them swapped stories about being taken like anecdotes at a party. Dex didn't hold it against Cutter. Cutter hadn't grabbed him, and even if he had, it was just a job. That was what they always said in mob stories, wasn't it? It wasn't personal. It was just business. Maybe you could give them some pointers or something, Cutter joked, but Dex only shrugged. Ryan would follow him, but the rest would go out of their way to prove they didn't work. They don't like me, and the feeling is kind of mutual. Well, it's to be expected, I guess. Most of these guys won't even make decent minders when they wash out. You, however, have got a real future with the minders, if you don't graduate. Dex wasn't sure how to take that and decided to just nod. Do most of the kids join up? The ones who don't graduate, I mean. Cutter nodded. Nearly all of them. Some of them leave, and it's hard to function out there, knowing what you know. They may resent the black site for taking them, but it's harder out there. You know that. Here we have structure, order, Out there, it might as well be Lord of the Flies." "Do the ones who graduate join up too?" Dex asked, feeling a buzz of pride as Ryan outpaced the group and made it to the climbing wall. Cutter was quiet for a moment, and when Dex looked up, he saw the older man staring at the kids in a very different way. The guy looked like a Navy SEAL, a huge man who could have taken any of the kids and broken them, maybe any two of them over his knee. He didn't seem to be a man that was often afraid, and the look of mystified terror on his face was the scariest thing that Dex had ever seen. No, the graduates go somewhere else. Their mission is not the same as ours, Dexter." "Our mission, sir?" "I like you, kid. You got a yard of guts, but I don't really think you're graduation material. The eggheads that graduate are rarely wearing red bands. Red bands are the muscle core, kid, and they know it. 90% of their minders and snatchers come from the red bands, and I think you've got a promising future at it." "I don't know about that," Dex said, not even taking offense at the implication that he couldn't graduate. "I don't think I could ever snatch kids." Cutter shrugged. "I see the way you are with the smaller ones, the ones who need a friend. You can also be tough, which is something you need here too. You've seen how I can whip up the kids, but what you haven't seen is me have to get mean yet. I can be a real bastard, Dex. Don't doubt it. There are some people," he spat the words like it was bitter, "overseas who could attest to that. These kids need looking out for sometimes, though. And Dex, I think you'd be good at it." Dex opened his mouth, but Cutter shook his head. "You don't gotta say nothing. Just think about it, and keep an open mind." He walked away then, yelling at Dick to stop effing around, and Dex almost missed his chance. "Sir," he yelled, and Cutter turned back to look at him. "Yeah, I know the minders are supposed to keep the peace. You said so on your first day, but what happens to students who attack each other?" Cutter grinned. "Thinking of thinning the competition before they get to your level?" Dex didn't answer. Let him think what he wanted. Fist fights, attempted murders, even poisoning are grounds for termination. If it's something more subtle, though, something like your friend there can do," he said, indicating Ryan, "then I'd say it'd be chalked up to just one of those things. This place runs by the law of the jungle. Only the strong survive. Some kids don't make it to graduation. Some of you kids leave with a little blood on your hands. Don't worry, though. You'll get fresh blood on the job." He walked off then, and Dex wondered exactly what he had gotten himself into. Masha was trying to concentrate on the lesson, but it was hard as she felt the push of angry bees against her skull. How had she never felt this before? It was so obvious now that she was aware of it. It was like losing a tooth and finding the hole. Now that she was aware of the energy pushing towards her, she couldn't not feel it. The energy you push out is best visualized when it's being formed. It takes the form that you choose, but it must be molded into what you need for your... Mrs. Cashmere was droning on and on about something, but Masha was hardly paying attention. All around her was a soft buzzing of placid energy, as the others let their minds wander too. If she reached out with her mind, Masha could feel what they were doing, but she tried to let them have their privacy. Sometimes she did it without meaning to. Touching that energy came to her as easily as listening, and that was how she had found out that Heather and Daniel were interested in each other. They weren't in love, but they liked each other, and they had done the thing that grown-ups did sometimes. They were being what her mother would call mushy right now, sending little mental love notes to each other as they tried not to stare at each other. Britt and Jenny were playing a card game in their head, something of their own invention, and Chandra, sitting way in the back, was attempting to break into her mind for some reason. Masha could already see the terrible things that she was pushing through her mental barrier, and it took a lot of effort not to cry. Why was she doing this? Masha had never done anything to her, and she was just being mean for no reason. Didn't seem to matter why, though. It was happening, and there didn't seem to be much she could do about it. Why not? The voice was strong, direct, a much older version of her own voice, and one that made her look up and take notice. It's your head. They're your dreams. Why can't you do something? It's your mind. You can do anything you want. Anything I want, Masha almost said out loud. As Ms. Cashmere droned on, Masha suddenly imagined her mind as a castle, something with big stone walls and a moat. The energy coming in was a strong wind, something that had been trying to blow down a shack, but was suddenly butting up against a high, strong wall. She felt an immediate end to the angry pressure on the back of her head. Glancing in her periphery, she saw Chandra's eyebrows knit together, her forehead dimpling as she pressed out hard. Blow, wind, blow, Chandra said lightly. You can't get me. She turned back to the lesson, her defenses in place, and wondered what other surprises could be in place when the girl came poking around that night. She would be ready for her, that was for sure, and who knew what might be waiting. The middle box, Gerald said, pointing to the blue one. Gerald stuck his hand through the hole, the string coming off of it green, and found a candy bar. The green one, box 1, contained a bunch of broken glass. The orange one, box 3, contained a large black scorpion that flexed its stinger as the lid came off. Gerald nodded, seeing the test for what it was. The other two both contained orange strings, which would have sent him to the infirmary for sure. The tests that Dr. Hammarskjöld was conducting were becoming more and more interesting as time went on. Yesterday, he had asked him to pick a door. The first one had a red string, the second one had an orange string, but the third one had a less orange string than the middle one. The third door had contained a dog, one of the big ones that would bite, but Gerald had closed the door as it began to growl. The other two had contained a gun that was rigged to fire if he had opened it, and a hive of bees that had swarmed around the room. Before that, it had been more mazes, but Hammarskjöld was done playing it safe, it seemed. He wanted to test Gerald's ability, and he was willing to draw blood for it. What color were the other two strings? Hammarskjöld asked, making notes. Orange, Gerald said. Neither of them would have killed me, probably. Good, good. Next test. Gerald turned to find 4 boxes, a red one, a blue one, a green one, and a yellow one. They all had holes cut into the top of them. All of them looked benign, but Gerald hesitated before walking too close. They were all set up as if they didn't hold anything more dangerous than a paper cut, but all 4 had glowing red strings attached to them. The red thrummed, pulsing with danger, and Gerald turned back to the little doctor, raising an eyebrow questioningly. Go on. Pick one. There is no safe box, Gerald said. Sorry, Dr. Hammarskjöld said, looking up from his notes. There's no safe box. All the boxes have red strings. Interesting, he said, stroking his chin. What would you normally do in a situation like this? Wait for one of them to change, Gerald said. And if it didn't? It's never happened before, Gerald said with a shrug. Well, make your choice. Make your choice and be damned by it. Gerald started to refuse, but realized it wouldn't matter. He approached the boxes, listening and bumping them as he tried to pick the one that was the least likely to kill him. The red box contained something that rolled around, like a stone or something. The blue box emitted a loud and familiar rattle, and Gerald moved away quickly. The green box made a metallic sound, and Gerald thought he knew what was inside that, too. But the yellow one gave away nothing. It was heavy, like It had weights in it or something, and after pursing his lips, Gerald went to the red one and stuck his hand in. Maybe they had tried to trick him by putting it in the red one, knowing he would assume that that was the bad one. He pulled his hand out, but when he saw the strawberry, he dropped it like it was a poisonous insect. He turned to find Hammershoal holding out an EpiPen, and he breathed a little easier after the shot was administered. "Oh, it was a dirty trick," he said, feeling his throat contract. "I'm extremely allergic to strawberries. Yes, we know. It's in your medical file, hence the pen." Gerald took a few deep breaths, trying to get his heart rate under control, and finally took a seat as his body warred against its desire to close his throat up. "So, what's in the other boxes?" "The first one was a strawberry, as you know. The second had a rattlesnake. The third held a bear trap, and the fourth held a small incendiary device that would have probably caused you to lose your arm and about half your face." Gerald gulped. The little doctor was certainly not playing around. "I would think something like that would have gotten you too," he said sullenly. But Dr. Hammershoal shook his head. "I would have lost some hair, maybe an eyebrow, but I put my chair well outside the blast zone." Gerald took a few minutes to settle himself before getting up and testing his balance. He had allergic reactions before, but they were never very fun. He had to be particularly careful at home because his parents didn't keep needles around for long. If it happened at school, then he was covered. But if he had an allergic reaction at home, he was likely to die before anyone noticed him. "Any more surprises today?" he asked a little more sulkily. "No, I believe that's all. Thank you, Gerald." Gerald picked up his candy bar, but stopped as he turned to the door. "I have a question, sir," he said, seeing the little doctor look up from his notes. "What is the protocol if a student is being harassed by another student?" Dr. Hammershoal thought it over. "Well, normally there would be inquiries made, but I'm assuming you aren't talking about out in the open bullying." Gerald thought about it and shook his head. "Well, generally the kindergarten operates under the rules of the jungle model. Weaklings don't graduate, and it's often up to the strong to weed them out." "And if a promising student is killed or made useless in the process?" Gerald asked, already figuring he knew the answer. Hammershoal only shrugged. "Only the strong survive. They would make a token effort at an investigation, but ultimately, nothing would be done." "I see. Thank you for your honesty, sir," Gerald said, leaving the doctor to his work. Message received. They were on their own. "So what you're saying is we're on our own," Dunstan said morosely. "Sounds like it," Gerald said. "He as good as said that we were free to rip each other to shreds, as long as we weren't too overt about it." "Well, crap," Dunstan said, his can running dry as he drank from the bendy straw. The five of them were sitting in the media room, talking about what they would do tonight. Rebecca was reading eclipse, Masha was lost in thought, and Dex was pretending to watch TV, but Dunstan and Gerald weren't fooled. Something was on his mind, but whatever it was, he wasn't sharing. He'd been quiet through dinner, too, he and Masha both, but if Dex was lost in thought, then Masha looked like she was working on something. She looked like one of those kids who's glued to their tablet when they're working on something they're passionate about. A house in Minecraft, or maybe some kind of puzzle. "We kind of figured it would be a lost cause, didn't we?" Gerald asked, and Dunstan nodded as he hooked the empty can into the garbage can. It hit the rim, bounced off the wall, and fell in with an angry rattle. Dunstan pumped his arm in the air before turning back to Gerald. "So, what can we do about it?" said Dunstan. "Well, we can get some evidence." "And do what?" Dex said, seeming to come out of his thoughts long enough to shoot down theirs. "They already said they wouldn't help, and I doubt she's dumb enough to write it in her journal." "Yeah, but if I could get her hairbrush or something," Dunstan said, but Dex shook his head. It's still your word against hers, and they don't care. Then we hit her first, Dunstan said. We make her stop. We threaten her or beat her up. She's just a girl. We can... A, Rebecca said over the top of her book, that's pretty sexist. B, she's just a girl who can implant ideas into people's heads. What's to stop her from convincing all three of you that you're chickens or cows or something? It's going to be hard to defend your friend if you're all farm animals. Dunstan growled in his throat. Okay then, smarty pants, what would you do? Rebecca shrugged. Probably drug her. She can't do anything if she's asleep, can she? We could get our hands on some sleep medication and... Don't bother, Masha said, making the boys on either side of her jump as she came out of her very serious silence. I can handle this. They all looked at her, not quite believing. Then, why has it gone on so long? Rebecca asked. If you could stop it, then why have you been letting her attack you? Masha fixed her old young eyes on Rebecca, and the girl shuddered under that unwanted scrutiny. Because I wasn't aware that it was happening. If I had known, I would have blocked her out. Now that I know, I can stop it. Rebecca looked unsure, but couldn't much argue with the girl's look of determination. So, is there anything we can do to help? Dex asked. I don't think so, Masha said. Just keep an eye peeled tonight in case of trouble. I don't know what will happen if I fight back, but I might not be the one screaming tonight when she comes to mess with me. Masha went back to staring into the middle distance, but her friends made a point to look away. The little girl had an intensity that was not altogether healthy. Chandra was washing her face in the sink when her ex-best friends came in. She smirked at them in the mirror, figuring this had something to do with the little brain trust she had seen gathered up at dinner. Maybe the little bitch had told them that she was using her gifts to hurt her. Maybe she had asked them to tell her to stop. Chandra didn't care either way. She wasn't going to ease off until the little bitch was as crazy as a porta-potty rat. You two got something on your mind? She asked, looking up questioningly. Say it if you do, but make it quick. I want to catch tonight's episode of Riverdale, and I don't want to fight for a good spot. Brittany opened her mouth, but seemed to think better of it. Jenny beat her to it. There's a rumor that you're messing with Masha. That's why she's screaming every night. Chandra turned around and leaned against the sink. So what if I am? Chandra, that's downright evil, Brittany said, looking shocked. Not only is it hurting her, but it's hurting everyone else, too. Yeah, that's kind of the point, Chandra said, looking at the two of them furiously. If the whole dorm is tired of being kept awake, maybe they should do something about it. Like hurt Masha? Jenny asked, putting her hands on her hips. Chandra blew a strand of hair out of her eyes. Were these two really here to try to guilt her into laying off? If that's what it takes. She's such a little thing. I don't figure it would take much. Maybe that big dumb brute who protects her will do it one night when he's tired of being kept awake. Maybe the blonde guy in the red band class. Maybe it'll even be one of you two. Doesn't matter to me. I'll sleep like a baby. My hands are clean. Both of them looked alarmed, and that made her laugh. Come on, ladies. Don't tell me neither of you have used your powers for something you want. Jenny, didn't you tell me you made that boy stop picking on you by convincing him that he loved you? Britt, wasn't there that girl who you... Stop it, Brittany said. We told you those things in confidence while we were swapping secrets. I don't even know why this surprises us. You told us about a couple of people you had messed with your little ability. Why should it be any different here? Chandra only shrugged. Exactly my point. Don't act like I'm the bad guy here. We all have a little blood on our hands, don't we? When I break that little bitch, it would be a good idea to come back and say you're sorry. It'd be an even better idea to fall on your knees and beg my forgiveness. Because once she's out of the way, maybe I'll decide that you guys are the problem. We'll stop you Jenny said. "We know what you're doing. We'll fight back." Chandra's laugh bounced off the bathroom walls like a super ball. "That little girl has more ability in her little finger than you two have put together. If she can't stop me, then what hope do either of you have? You can't keep me out. I'll break either of you in record time. You can bow beside the throne or set yourself against it. That's your choice." She pushed through them, parting them easily as she went on her way. Her smile wasn't as certain as it could have been, though. The little bitch had stopped her earlier today, and she didn't know how. Her thoughts had butted up against something strong, stronger than the usual passive resistance at least. She had hit a wall, and it had stopped her flat. She had gotten a brief image of a castle, but it was gone just as fast. Chandra had pushed at her a few times that day, but the result had always been the same. She let her thoughts slip away as she took the remote from some blue band girl and took her seat before the flat screen. She couldn't maintain something like that while she was asleep. Once she was snoring, Chandra would get back in, and tonight it would not be gentle. Chandra was tired of playing with the little bitch. Tonight she would break her. Tonight she would flood her mind with the sickest things imaginable, and the little girl would melt like a summer popsicle. By tomorrow, Chandra thought, as she watched Veronica lay out her latest plan for tonight's story, Masha would be a shaking pile of goo, and Chandra would be back where she belonged, as the queen of this little freak show. As she sat in the armchair, crossing her legs and watching primly, she felt like a queen. No, not a queen, she thought. She felt like the woman from Derek's comics. Derek, Dickie to his friends, was a little nerd like the rest of these kids, and he had a special place for comic books, despite how much her father hated them. She would have never said so. Comics were nerd shit. But her brother had been reading one at the breakfast table one morning when she had caught sight of a woman sitting amidst a group of well-dressed gentlemen. When she had asked who the woman was, Dickie had gushed endlessly about her. The woman was vicious, compassionless, and utterly set on her goals. If Dex liked to think of himself as Professor Xavier, then Chandra liked to imagine herself as Emma Frost, and tonight she would crush this wannabe Jean Grey and put aside her only true rival. Dex was coming back from brushing his teeth when Dick called his name. The boy was standing alone for once, but Dex had little doubt that his lackeys were lingering nearby. "What you want, Dick?" Dex asked, making the name sound like an insult. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but I want to start over. It's pretty clear that you have the mettle for this, and I want you as a friend, not an enemy." "Uh-huh," Dex said, crossing his arms and looking at Dick skeptically. "So, why not come sit with us tomorrow for breakfast? We can all work out together, and you can hang with some like-minded people. What do you say?" Dex thought about it, weighing the other boy's sincerity and finding it lacking. Would Ryan be welcome to come sit with us? Dick laughed, like Dex had just said the funniest thing in the world. "That runt? Of course not. You gotta cut the fat a little, D. The kid's holding you back. You've got a lot of dead weight around you, in fact. Why not come hang out with us and get rid of some of that?" But Dex walked past him. He'd heard enough, but as Dick put a hand on his shoulder, it appeared he hadn't said enough yet. "Don't be stupid, Dex. You need friends in here. Friends on your level. No one survives this place alone, I hear." "Last time I checked, 3 was less than 10, Dex growled, letting Dick know with his eyes that he needed to remove that hand. Dick must have gotten the message because he took it off and folded his arms too. "I mean real friends, not dependents. Those kids are as good as leeches. You need people to watch your back." "From who?" Dex asked. "Seems like it's just you and your cronies who are making trouble." "You don't get it, do you? We're red bands, man. I've checked it out. Red bands don't graduate, Dex. Red bands join the brute squad almost 100% of the time. There have been 4 red bands to graduate in the whole history of the kindergarten, and we would be the 52nd class. Dex didn't bother to ask how he discovered this, but it seemed that Dick might not be as stupid as he looked. This little speech got a point, or are you just airing out your cheeks? My point is that we are going to be the snatchers and minders who come after them. Cutter's a snatcher. He makes no bones about that, and it's pretty obvious that they aren't just going to let us go once we're caught. None of your little friends are going to hit the road with you. Most of them won't even stick around to be minders. They'll leave you behind, Dex. You need some friends with some lasting power. Friends like me. Dex shook his head and walked off. I won't make the offer again, Dick said from behind him. Dex snorted. I'm not sure why you made it to start with, he said, moving off towards whatever fresh hell tonight brought. What do you want, dwarf? Cutter asked, leaning on his desk. Hammershoal pursed his lips. He hated Cutter, almost as much as Cutter hated him, he suspected, but he needed some information. As much as he despised him, Cutter heard things he wasn't supposed to hear, and Hammershoal had a sneaking suspicion that he was one of the few non-washouts to know what lay in paradise, the reward that awaited after graduation. If he did, he kept it to himself. People with big mouths seem to get silenced around here. Information. I have reason to believe that a student might be in trouble. Gosh, you don't say, Cutter said, putting a hand to his cheek in false amazement. It's almost like they live in a nut house. Charles Xavier's home for dangerous kiddos. Dr. Hammershoal did his best not to look amused. I just need your information, not your comedy. Cutter wiped his nails on his scrubs, looking like a carnival barker at Coney Island. You know, information around here doesn't come cheap, short stuff. What do you got to trade? Hammershoal tried to keep the disgust off his face. You're a sick man. Do you know that? Yeah. Stop doing your impression of my ex-wife. Show me what you got. Hammershoal hated it, but he had already expected something like this. He reached into his desk and took out a garment that Dunstan would have recognized very well if Hammershoal hadn't made him forget about it. It was red, white, and blue, a Ralph Lauren polo, the kind you could pick up at Goodwill for a couple of bucks. This one, however, was special. The last owner had been evaporated from the teeth up by a sniper while he shot at a diplomat in Philadelphia about 10 years ago. There was no way that Cutter could have known that, but his eyes lit up when he saw the shirt like a kid on Christmas. Ah, I can smell it. Gimme, he said, holding his hands out for the shirt. Information first, then you get your prize. Cutter blew out like a horse. Spoil sport. Okay, what is it specifically you want to know? Hammershoal blinked at him. Is there more than one student planning violence on another? Cutter laughed. Little man, there are 20 kids here. The world only had 4 people before one of them felt that was too many, so you can imagine how bad it is here. One of the blue bands, Gerald, asked me about a student who might be planning to attack another student. The boy does not seem particularly inclined to violence, so I'm wondering who he's talking to. Cutter's smile faded, and he looked thoughtful for a change. Hammershoal didn't like it. It was like watching an animal trying to figure out a lock. Just so happens that one of my boys asked me the same thing. Dexter was curious about what would happen if 2 students fought, and what the staff would do about it. What did you tell him? Hammershoal asked, and winced as the smile returned. That the laws of the jungle rule here, and as long as no one caught him, there wouldn't be any problems. Hammarskjöld nodded. He knew this Dexter, by reputation if not by sight, and that narrowed the field a little. Dexter had a group around him, a mixture of bands that made up nearly half the students, and if they were planning violence, that could be bad. I need more than that if you want this. I need something definitive that I can take to Security Chief Ripley. Cutter thought about it. Dick and his little group clearly don't like Dexter or his friend Ryan. There's some green band coos who hates the little girl in that class. Can't say I blame her much. That bitch is smarmy. Other than that, usual squabbles. There really isn't much. This class is sickeningly harmonious. Hammarskjöld nodded. Dex palled around with a lot of green bands, and some of the blue bands, too. It had been hard to miss the fact that Gerald and Rebecca had been with him today. It still hurt him a little to see the hatred on Rebecca's face when she saw him, but he supposed it was to be expected. He had betrayed her, and he made it a point to never be alone with her. Okay, as I thought, he said, tossing the shirt to Cutter. Cutter buried his face in it, and Hammarskjöld tried not to cringe. No matter how much they wash it, no matter how much they try to get it out, the scent of death always lingers, and it's sweet indeed. I was hesitant. Who wouldn't be? But I found myself going with him after a moment of contemplation. I know that sounds nuts, but I didn't feel as if I were talking to a stranger. I had watched this guy on TV for a long time, and he just seemed like a family friend to me. He took me inside and hung the lantern up over the bar, smiling hugely as he brought his hands together. Welcome, my dear, welcome to my general store. I'm so glad to see that you've come to Bright Farms at long last. I blinked. It was like he was doing nothing more than opening the show for another episode. Was he crazy or just a little simple? I didn't know, but when he brought a rough brown sack out from under the counter, I took a step back. He laughed, not seeming to understand. Don't worry, my dear. There's something a little less conspicuous for you to wear while we cross the farm. We wouldn't want to have to answer questions before we find your mother, would we? That made sense, I supposed, and I opened up the sack to find a homespun dress, a bonnet, and some underthings. There were no shoes, but I supposed my tennis shoes wouldn't show from under the dress. I ended up just pulling the dress on over my clothes and slid the bonnet into place as I handed him back the undergarments. He nodded, clearly having expected me to change, but he accepted the bag and indicated I should follow him into the store. I had expected you sooner, Brother Thomas said, as we walked through the back of the general store, but I suppose later better than never. Yeah, I imagine you did, I said, putting some things together, probably in a squad car. Brother Thomas laughed to himself. Well, yes, but only because the sheriff is such a good friend to the church. We had him on the lookout for you so we could get you here before the ceremony, but he said he had lost track of you. That's dangerous in Tylerville, my dear. Some people in town don't think much of us. I can imagine, I said, not really wanting to tell him about the people in the sewers. They were fighting for their lives, it seemed, and I had no illusion about the idea that Brother Thomas could end that struggle. We had been walking as he talked, and we came to a halt outside a huge cowshed I knew as the Wonder Barn. This was the place where miracles happened on the show, and I wondered how many miracles actually took place behind those doors. Your mother is inside, he said, putting a key into the lock and opening the door wide. In the Wonder Barn? I asked, and when he nodded, I crossed my arms. Why, isn't she in the chapel where the service is being held? Because I called her here. She didn't want to come, but when I told her that her only daughter was waiting for her, she came quick enough. She's been waiting for a while, so if you intend to see her before the ceremony, I'd shake a leg." I was hesitant, but what if he was right? I didn't want to start off on the wrong foot, and I was already so late. Brother Thomas had led me here, after all. Why would he now try to mess things up when I was so close to the finish line? I stepped inside, studying myself as he smiled and nodded. 15th stall on the right, dear. You can't miss her." I turned to ask if he was coming too, but that was when he closed the door and left me in the dark. I knew it, I chided myself, pounding on the door and yelling for him to let me out. Then the lights began to come on, a string of dome lights that seemed to go on for miles, and I saw the pins spread out like holding cells. As I watched, a familiar voice came down the hall, calling my name. It was her. It was my mother. She was calling me. "Angel, is that you? Come to Mother, Angel. I've waited so long." I was running before I could stop myself, and the stalls flew by as I silently counted. The stalls were interesting, but my mind was set. There was treasure in some, a whole car in another, children and things, and all kinds of stuff. Some of them were dark, too, shadowy corridors full of reflective eyes, and these I barely looked at. I was counting, and when I came to stall 15, I saw her there. It occurs to me now that I don't think I'd ever told you what my mother looked like. She's not a tall woman, maybe 5'4", with a head of corn silk colored hair and a smile that takes up a whole room. She was dressed in a simple dress, the one I had always seen her in. But her eyes, the same eyes I have, were the color of the ocean on a summer day. She looked up as if on cue and smiled at me as she spread her arms wide, inviting me in for a hug. "Welcome, Angel. I've waited so very long to see you. Come give your mother a hug." "Mom?" I half whispered, not sure this could be real, but wanting it to be true so badly. "Of course, Angel. Who else could it be?" She held her arms out, waiting for me to take the hint, and I ran to her. I dropped to my knees, wrapping my arms around her as we embraced. Her scent was familiar, a fragrance I had smelled in the bathroom during my childhood. It was jasmine and saffron, honeysuckle, old baby powder, the ghosts that haunted that bathroom. I'd seen Dad come in sometimes when I was getting ready for school or learning to use the toilet and just breathe in like he couldn't get enough of the smell. He would smile sadly, looking at me like I might be a ghost too, and then pat my head before going on his way. Her arms were warm as they wrapped around me, and I felt my eyes beginning to tear up. "I've waited to meet you for so long. I'm so proud of you, Angel. I'm so proud of the woman that you've grown up to be. I love you, dear." I felt the tears coming harder, but as I basked in the smell, this little voice kept clawing at the back of my brain. She didn't even know I existed until I was 6. She doesn't know anything about you, so how could she be proud? She hadn't even seen me till a day ago in years. How could she know me? She knew nothing about me. She knows nothing about me. Then my eyes popped open and I took a closer look at the smiling woman I was hugging. She looked like I had known she would, blonde and smiling and slight, but that was how I had expected her to look. She looked exactly like she had on the show, like exactly the way she had looked on the show. She looked as if she hadn't changed at all since I was 6. And that was the problem. "Just like you wanted," said a voice from behind me, and I heard Brother Thomas approaching. "She's exactly what you wanted. She can always be exactly what you wanted if you stay with us. Aren't you tired of looking for purpose, Angel? Aren't you tired of wondering what could be? Well, wonder no more. Come join the Bright, and all your worries will be as nothing. But I took my arms off her and stood up suddenly. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds easy, but you have no idea how hard it was to take my arms off the woman who looked like my mother. She was saying the things I had always longed to hear, giving me the affirmation that I had craved, but it wasn't real. The smells were things that she would not have been able to keep in this world. The words were ideas that she had never expressed any of the times that I had seen her, and it was all a little too good to be true. I could almost feel my fingers creaking as I released her. My hands coming undone was a misery. But as I stood up, I wiped my tears away and looked at Thomas with real anger. "That isn't my mother." "What?" Thomas said, his smile brittle as he took a step back. "Of course it is. Don't lie to me, you son of a bitch. I know that's not my mom. She's the mom I wanted, but she isn't my real mom. She's probably up at that chapel, and I think you've delayed me long enough." I made to step past him, but he put a hand out to stop me. "Angel, this is what the Bright has given you. It's best not to spit on its gifts. This is what you wanted, thus the Bright has provided. Why not stay with a mother that will love you, that will be proud of you, that will shackle me to this place forever? Not likely." Thomas laughed, shaking his head. If you think your mother will be any better, then you are in for quite a shock. Why not stay here with this one? Have the mother you always wanted, the mother you deserve. Don't throw away your happiness for a mother that will never love you." He smiled at me, clearly meaning for it to be reassuring, but I shrugged his hand off. I'd rather be disappointed than live a lie. I walked past him, Thomas watching me pass a few of the stalls before calling out to me. "Angel, if you leave the Wonder Barn, there won't be any coming back. You won't be able to bask in the comfortable warmth of your mother again, and I won't be able to help you with the consequences. Come back, be happy, or proceed into misery. The choice is yours." I had stopped. God, I wanted to go back and have a mother who loved me. I could already see a nice little house for the two of us, something near the general store. We could cook meals and worship the Bright and be happy. She would braid my hair in the evenings. I could read to her. She would put me to bed and tell me how much she loved me, and I would never have to wander again. A very comfortable lie that I could stay caged in forever. I walked to the exit and closed the barn door behind me, closing out that comfortable delusion forever. I could still see the lights burning in the chapel on the hill. I made for it, and the consequences be damned. She had been out to lunch with Marguerite when Juliet had called her in a state of extreme anxiety. "Doc, you gotta come back quick. There's a situation at the clinic." Maggie looked up from her steak, the waiter turning a little green as she cut into the very, very rare meat, and marveled at the texture. "What's wrong, Juliet? Is it one of my special clients?" She couldn't help but picture the dark-haired man, the one who made her feel like her fillings were vibrating, sitting on her couch and talking about things that she couldn't know, things he would have no way to know. It's Sheriff Guthrie. He's brought someone here and says he needs you to help with something." Winter rolled her eyes. Sheriff Guthrie was an element in Cashmere outside her control, and that wasn't something that happened often. Sheriff Guthrie was a transplant, one of the few people to just arrive in Cashmere, and he had attached himself to the local sheriff's department not long after. He had experience and a lengthy resume, so the previous sheriff, Sheriff Masterson, had given him a shot. He was a little overzealous for her taste, but Masterson had liked him, and Winter tried not to interfere in the town politics any more than she had to. When the sheriff disappeared a couple of months ago, the circumstances were murky at best. Deputy Guthrie had stepped in as temporary sheriff until Masterson was found, or the next election cycle could weed him out. So far, he'd done a passable job. A passable job up until now. "Temporary Sheriff Guthrie is aware that I have office hours and appointments, isn't he?" Juliet was quiet for a moment, someone speaking in a low, pissy voice, before coming back to the phone. "The sheriff says he'll be happy to pay you for the session, but it's a matter of public safety and requires your assistance immediately." Winter sighed. It appeared there was no dodging this one. "Very well, Juliet. Tell the sheriff that I will be there in 10 minutes. She hung up on Juliet and turned to find Maggie watching her pensively. "Is something wrong, my love?" she asked, her worry at odds with the look of ecstasy on her face as she devoured the steak. "That was Juliet. Apparently I'm needed back at the clinic. Some kind of emergency involving the temporary sheriff." Maggie wrinkled her nose. "I do not like him. He is odd, and sometimes when he sees me, it is like he knows I am not like him," she said, struggling to find the right words. Winter hadn't considered that, but Maggie had got her thinking about it. Guthrie often smiled, his hands in his pockets, as he projected that lazy, good old boy attitude that was so prevalent in this area. But she couldn't deny that he often seemed like he knew something that he shouldn't. It was nothing she could prove. He never said anything incriminating, but it was a feeling that she couldn't shake. I'm not the biggest fan of our stand-in lawman, but he is effective at keeping the peace. Let me see what's so important, and I'll see you at dinner. She kissed her on the forehead, her face red with blood, and paid the bill on the way out. Dr. Pamela Winters would never have it said that she was a cheap date. She arrived at the clinic 10 minutes later to find Sheriff Guthrie, Deputy Parks, and a pale, twitchy young man in one of her exam rooms. The kid was dressed in hiking clothes, one of his feet free of both boot and sock, and he looked as if he had rolled through a thorn bush recently. There was blood on his cheek, a long cut running behind his ear and up to the hairline, and scratches across his arm and legs and face. He looked like he'd been to war instead of the woods. "Sheriff Guthrie," Dr. Winters said pleasantly, "and Deputy Parks, too. What was so important that I had to cancel my lunch date?" Amos Guthrie was not some fat-bodied boss hog type of lawman. She had seen him running most mornings, passing him on her way to work, and she knew that his arms were corded with muscle, as were his legs. He had hooked his thumbs into his belt, smiling at her from under his thick blonde mustache, and giving her a casual once-over that held none of the usual greedy lecherousness others exhibited. Winter was aware that she was an attractive woman, but when Guthrie assessed her, it always seemed like he was preparing for a fight he intended to win. "Sorry for the hassle, Doc," he said, his accent on full display, "but we had a little something we were hoping you could help us with." "And what might that be?" Winter asked, her smile frosty. "Dr. Winters," he said, turning to motion a hand at the young man, "this is David Wild. He went missing in the woods a few days ago, and when we found him, he had quite a story for us. We were hoping you could help him make sense of it. Maybe use your special talents to help him understand what he saw exactly." Winter raised an eyebrow at him, wondering how this one had heard about her services. Guthrie was not a client, but she supposed she already knew the answer. Deputy Parker, a man whose thick black mustache did nothing to hide his sheepish expression, was a client, and he had probably told Guthrie that Winter could help. She'd have to have a talk with him about that, but for now, she guessed that she could play along. She walked over to the area where she prepared her tea and trusted that Guthrie would follow. He seemed almost happy to oblige. "Just what the hell is this about?" Winter said, lowering her voice as she fixed tea mechanically. Guthrie looked back at Parks and the kid, giving his deputy a nod before continuing. "Kid saw something, and it's something I would rather he not take home with him. There's weird stuff in those woods. You know that as well as I do. And if he goes home talking about creatures in the woods and strange things in the pine barrens," Winter almost dropped her teapot. "How the hell did he get to the pine barrens?" Guthrie looked over his shoulder again, checking to make sure that no one had heard her. "I don't know, but that's where he claims to have been. We still haven't found his brother, so we can only assume he might still be there. We need this kid to forget where he was, forget what he saw, or the next people that go into those woods might come back with footage of what may or may not be out there." Winter understood now. Guthrie was asking her to help him maintain some of the security around here, and Winter wasn't opposed to it. She had misgivings about Guthrie, but about Cashmere there were no such hesitations. This was her home, her place, and she would defend it tooth and nail if need be. "We do not make a habit of this, do you understand?" she said, and Guthrie nodded solemnly. "And you absolutely will pay me for this session," she added, which made him laugh. Wouldn't dream of cheating the town's favorite doctor. Winter went back to making tea as Guthrie went back to join Parks. When she brought the cup back, Guthrie looked longingly at the pot. "Smells exotic. I could stand for a cup of Amos Wayland Guthrie," she half-whispered, and she saw him shudder as she pronounced his name with the weight of a spell. "As much as I would love to watch you spill your guts in my office, this tea isn't for you. This tea is only for people who want to forget." She looked back at the hiker. The sheriff had called him David and handed him the cup. "Have some tea, David. You'll need your strength so you can tell me what you saw." His hands shook as he took the cup, and after a single hard blow across the steam, he took a sip before beginning. "My brother and I, we went to the Pine Barrens. I don't know what we saw, but we... Why don't you start from the beginning? I find that sometimes it's easier when we start where it all began." David nodded, took another sip, and started over. "My brother and I are avid hikers. We've been across the country, hiking deserts, forests, basins, coastlines, even a stretch of tundra in Alaska. You name it, and if it's in the United States, we've hiked it. That's what brought us here. We were looking for a challenge. Josh and I had hiked the Appalachian Trail about 2 years ago, and some guys we met on the trail, guys from Cashmere, had some crazy stories about hiking in their local woods. They talked about strange creatures, weird flora they had seen, and even how they'd been chased by something that sounded like a mountain lion. They made it sound so exotic, so alien, that Josh and I had to check it out. Well, Josh did. After listening to them about Cashmere, he got a little obsessed. He did a lot of research on the place, looking at maps and travel information, but he could never get as much as he wanted. He wanted to know everything, but there wasn't a lot of information online about Cashmere. It's weird, this whole town is like a blip, and the people who live here don't talk about it much. The one thing the guys did talk about, though, was the Pine Barrens. They said they had gone there as kids, scouts even, and that they had seen some weird lights and strange creatures there. That's where they got chased, actually. They got a little too close to the place, and whatever lived there didn't like it. They barely made it out, they said, and their scoutmaster hadn't been happy about it. He told them that they were never to go near the Pine Barrens again, and had canceled the rest of the trip just in case something had followed them back. They never found it again. They had been super young and couldn't remember exactly where they had been, but Josh was intrigued. When we were planning our trip this year, he said he wanted to finally go see Cashmere, and I was definitely game. We flew into Atlanta, rented a truck, bought some camping stuff, and headed out for Cashmere. We saw the sights, went to the Botanical Gardens, drove close enough to see Stragview, walked around that super haunted hospital you guys have, and when we had explored all of the town, well, as much as we wanted to, we hit the woods. Josh was pretty sure he knew where the Pine Barrens were. Some Google map searching had led him to believe that he'd found the right spot. So we left our rental truck in the town and headed for the outskirts on foot. We camped the first night in a large clearing about 20 miles from Stragview, near a scout camp in the East Woods. I've slept in a lot of places, in tents, under the stars, in caves, even with a canopy of trees over me, but I've never actually felt unsafe while camping. I don't mean wary. You have to be wary when you're in the wilderness, but what I felt was unsafe, in danger, as if my life might end at any moment. We lay in the tent, our bags zipped up as we sweated in the summer heat, and watched the shadows pace around us. They were lean, looking like panthers or cougars, and they seemed to drink the air as they stalked our tent. I believe, now that I've actually seen them, that they might be blind, running completely on smell and sound. But that night, I couldn't understand how we weren't discovered. They stalked us for nearly 3 hours, bumping into the tent with their weird bullet-shaped heads. And when they left, I felt like I would never be able to sleep. Somehow I caught a few hours, but when I told Josh that we should leave after we had packed up in the morning, he refused. "Go back if you want. I want to see this Pine Barren." He headed off in the direction he thought it should be, and as I followed behind him, I asked why it meant so much to him. He'd never even seen it. Why did he need to find it so badly? "I may not have seen it," he said, eyes ahead, "but I've dreamed about it. It's weird, you know, to dream about a place that you've never seen in life. I have to see it. If I don't find it, I think I might go crazy, Dave." I think that was when I realized what this meant to him. This wasn't just an interest, it had become a true obsession to him. If I didn't go with him, he'd go on by himself, and after the night before, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. So we trekked into the woods, the day escaping us as we went deeper and deeper into the East Woods. The maps say the woods should be less than 10 miles from edge to edge, but they seem to go on forever. There are roads that run through those woods, but but we never found him. The woods around Stragview are strange indeed, but the strangest sight was yet to come. It was getting dark, the sun riding low, and I had just opened my mouth to suggest that we might need to make camp when Josh stopped in his tracks. We were about 5 feet apart, the trees thinning out some, and he was standing on a little rise and looking ahead as I came up beside him. Up ahead was a patch of leaning pines, a small scratch amongst the birches and firs, and amidst the pines was a deep trench. It was a long, jagged cut in the earth, and it looked deep enough to reach all the way to hell. A movement around that hole pulled my eye to the left, and that was when I first saw them. My earlier assessment had been right. They were long and lean, powerfully built, and their bullet-shaped heads split open to reveal mouthfuls of jagged teeth. They sniffed the air, their snouts high, and the cry they loosed sent a shiver to my core. Those on the outside started tearing towards us, but I could see others pulling themselves out of the hole to join them. They were staying a step ahead of the setting sun, not seeming to like the feel of it, but it wouldn't stop them much longer. They'd seen us or smelled us, that much was clear, and Josh was making no effort to hide. I grabbed his hand, trying to pull him back, but he broke my grasp, and to my shock started running towards the creatures. I took a step towards him, trying to catch hold of him again, but as the creatures got closer, as he got closer to them, I started sprinting in the other direction. I didn't want him to get my brother, but I didn't want him to get me either. I was running off of pure instinct, flying into the depths of the woods with no real destination. And as I ran, I heard that hellish pack in the distance behind me. I was running off pure adrenaline then, stumbling heedlessly into the woods. As the light disappeared around me, the dark swallowing me up, I felt like I was running blind too. I was panicked, not sure what was going on, and I had no clue how long I ran through that darkness. When the ground suddenly disappeared out from under me, I could hear the beasts closing in on me. I fell into empty air, the moon showing me a gorge below me. I remember being relieved somehow that they wouldn't get me, and I would be allowed to die without those monsters getting to eat me. It came to the next morning, having fallen into a thorn bush. It had stopped my fall, but it had cut me up pretty badly. I pulled myself out and started limping along the bottom of the gorge. That's when the Rangers found me. That's how the police found me. The kid had been gagging for the last few minutes or so, and as his story came to a close, he made a choking sound and brought up the memory. It plopped into his cup, and Winter had it swooped away and over to the other side of the room before he could come around. It was small, discolored by the adrenaline and fear, but still serviceable. It would serve her needs, as they all did, and she found herself looking at it in the way that Maggie looked at a steak. She hated herself for it, but she could no more fight her nature than her lover could. The two officers watched her pensively, clearly not sure what to make of what they had just seen. "I expect you boys will keep what you saw here to yourself," she said, putting enough emphasis on it that they could read the quiet part clearly. "Of course," Sheriff Guthrie said, "as long as maybe we can depend on you for more consulting work in the future." Winter had expected as much and nodded. There were worse ways to make money. "When he comes out of that, tell him that you found him wandering in the woods after being lost. He'll believe it, but I recommend that you be on your way to the hospital when you tell him." Guthrie took the hint, and they shuffled him out quickly, promising to settle up before sunset. Winter sighed as she put David Wild's memory into a fresh jar. It bumped against a dustier vessel, and she was unsurprised to see the faded tape across it read Masterson. She took it out, replaced the new jar with the old, and looked at the slowly flashing red lump inside that jar. Masterson had been such a dear, such a broken mess of a man when she found him on that bench in Amarillo. He was still wearing the uniform, blood on the front and on the pants, but the stubble and the bottle of whiskey tucked into the bag told her that he might have been at this a while. He had looked up at her as she sat beside him, his eyes lost and childlike, and as she took the lid off the jar, she heard the same thing vibrate from the liquid inside as it had vibrated from his chapped lips that afternoon in 1987. I hadn't mean to shoot that kid. I thought he was with him. I turned and fired, and he just fell down, scared and cold, and asking me why. Masterson had been the sheriff in Cashmere for a long time. Too long, she supposed. He'd been a good lawman, and he'd known how to de-escalate a situation in a way that this new one would never learn. He had valued peace, not strife, and sometimes it almost seemed to flow from him like a cooling river. He had possessed a laugh that you could feel in your bones, a steadiness that could give you courage, and a quiet authority like no one she had ever known. She tilted the glass, feeling his memory slide into her, and she trembled as she drew in his power. It was warm and rich, and when she opened her eyes, she suddenly knew that he would never be back to leave another. He was gone beyond her, and that made her a little sad. As she washed out the jar, she wondered what sort of memories she could get from this new sheriff, this strutting peacock that was Amos Guthrie. She might have to find out, and find out what such a memory could be used for. I've worked construction since dropping out of high school, so about 20 years. I know most people don't think much of it, but if you haven't shivered in the night lately, then thank a construction worker, because we probably built the thing that's keeping the elements out. It's not glamorous work, but I've managed to claw my way up the ranks till I've got my own crew, run my own job sites, and live pretty comfortably. After 20 years, I've noticed that there are constants in this industry, but only 3 standouts: hard hats, lunch pails, and porta-johns. Job sites and porta-johns go together like, well, hand in glove. They're always necessary, always terrible to get stuck in for long periods of time, and always seem to smell both sterile and like a horse manure field. In 20 years, I've been inside more porta-johns than I have women, and unfortunately, I think some of them were cleaner. This particular time was a little different. A lot different. And it's something that sticks with me to this day. It's been weeks, months even, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat as I see that thing and hear it grind its teeth together. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. We were working on these new apartments, one of those big old buildings with about 8 units per floor and about 15 floors that are wedged between one another. One that's mostly the same thing. I was sipping my 5th cup of coffee when I heard the ominous rumble from my guts and knew what was coming. I'd had 2 breakfast burritos from Dolly's. She's an angel, but she goes heavy on the pepper. A whole pot of coffee, a hash brown as big as a pretzel, and now it was all coming to a head. The guy showing me the blueprints for the building looked at me with real worry and asked if I needed to take a minute. I told him I was fine, but He got about halfway through telling me about a problem with the wiring when it happened again. I gritted my teeth. That one might as well have been a starting pistol, and I told him I'd be right back. I made it to the lift just before the doors closed, and the guy who was taking it down looked worried as my stomach growled like a V8 with a bad carburetor. "Too many Dolly spicy chorizos, boss?" he said, and I nodded as the sweat started to stand out. "It's fighting with the pot of coffee and the hash brown in there, and it's anybody's bet who's gonna win. Remind me not to follow you into the John," he said with a laugh as the lift came to the ground floor. I was out and looking for one of the blue boxes that marked our porta potties. There were about 5 of them on the site, and wasn't long before I found one over by the office. I was waddling now, trying not to lose it right here in the yard, and the guys were laughing as I came ponderously towards my oasis in the desert. I closed the door, pushed the black locking bar into place, and had my pants down and my ass over the hole before I could embarrass myself any further. I checked for paper and was glad to find some, not always a given, and as the pressure began to relieve itself in the worst possible way, I closed my eyes and sighed happily. I'll save you the messy details, but needless to say, I was glad when it was finally over. I took out my phone, giving it some time to see if there was any more business to conduct. And that's when I became aware of the strange sound. First, I thought I might not be done, but I realized pretty quick that the slight splashing noise wasn't me. It was like something was making ripples in the water, splashing up a little as it stirred below, and I wondered if maybe I had dropped off a big enough payload to still be stirring in the tank. When it splashed again, this one high enough to wet my nethers with cold, dirty water, I stood up quickly. That had definitely been something alive splashing around in there, and I must have looked pretty silly just standing there, pants around ankles, as I stared into the hole. I fumbled at my phone, trying not to drop it in as well, and bent low so I could see into the fallow pit. It was hard to tell at first. The murky blue water looked like a subterranean lake more than anything, and the lighting inside wasn't helping matters in the least bit. I wondered if a snake had gotten in, maybe something bigger, and that was when I noticed something round coming out of the water. As it rose, I recognized it for what it was, the top of a very bald head. The tips of ears were sticking up from the surface of the muck, and as it rose I could see the beginnings of eyes as well. They were open, staring, utterly devoid of anything human. I stumbled back, nearly falling down as my feet tangled in my pants, and bumped hard against the door as the whole edifice shook on its base. What the hell was that, I wondered. Had some homeless guy gotten into our shitter? Had some freak gotten down there with nasty stuff on his mind? I didn't know, but what I did know was that I was locked in here with him. I reached for the lock, the light from my phone held forward so I could see, and when I heard a splash, I turned back in a hurry. The light from my phone fell across the opening, and the head that rose from it looked like some kind of creature from one of those old stories my friends and I had told to spook each other when we were young. Its skin was inky, though that could have had more to do with where he was residing. Its ears were long and pointed like a bat, and its eyes were white like a full moon. It rose from the festering swamp like a vampire from an old movie, its body simply rising without any mechanism to lift it. I wasn't sure if it was tall or capable of levitation or something, but its face came fully over the lip of the toilet lid, I saw the worst of it then. Its mouth was stretched into a perpetual grin, the teeth long and sharp as they fit together like puzzle pieces. As neatly as they came together, they still appeared to be too long for its mouth. They looked like they might be painful to it, the grin more of a grimace than anything. And they were gravel gray and slimy with something more viscous than saliva. In the dim light of the little toilet, it rose up to tower over me. It kept rising, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and I could see that its arms and legs were indeed longer than expected. They were nearly twice as long as its body, the hands ending in cruel claws. It leered at me, reveling in my fear, and I was paralyzed by it. The creature was terrifying, but I don't think that was all of it. There's certain places where you seem to believe that there's an illusion of safety. Your home, your bed, your bathroom, places you're at your most vulnerable and comfortable. You think of these places as safe, like sanctuaries, and when these places are violated, it feels like a violation of your person. It opened its mouth, giving me a good look at those gravel gray fangs, and as it hissed softly, it leaned forward like it was getting ready to strike. I don't know how I did it. I shouldn't have been able to move at all, but my hand seemed to come up all on its own and flick the plastic bar back that was holding the door closed. I went from cowering on the floor of a filthy porta-potty to scrambling across the yard of the job site, the light flooding in as it sent the creature shrinking back into that dark hole. I had crab-walked about 20 feet when I realized that I hadn't had time to pull my pants up, and I was scrambling half-naked across a job site with hundreds of people on it. I didn't think all of them were watching me, but that was way more eyes than I wanted there to be. I jerked my pants up, started yelling about some kind of animal being in the porta-potty. Some of the guys ran over to investigate. Others came to see if I was okay, but ultimately they didn't find nothing. I told the authorities when they got there too, that something had been in the tank, and it had come at me spitting mad. They got somebody out there to drain it, but they didn't find nothing. I hadn't expected they would. Whatever it was, it had gone back to hiding in the muck. I had the unit closed down and told the vendor that he could come and get it. He offered to bring me a new one, but that didn't help. I do my business off-site now, but I'll remember that grinning, dripping, terrible face for as long as I live. It was one of those things that I know no one will believe, but I swear I saw it. The other rangers, the young guys who don't believe much of anything, think I was just dehydrated. Maybe I was. If I don't believe what I saw, though, all I have to do is look at the old guys, the veterans of 1,000 lost kids and a decade of search and rescue missions, to know that they understand. Weird stuff happens out here. It's not something that everyone will get. For me, it was a lighthouse. It all started with a missing hiker, Clarence Young. He was about 22 and had just finished his 3rd year of med school. He was tall, about 6'2", muscular, an athlete who loved to run and hike and spend time outdoors. All of this had been told to us by his mother, as she cried and wailed and handed out pictures. He'd been hiking one of the mountains in the area, a regular enough climb that it wasn't terribly strenuous, but no one had heard from him in about 3 days, and the area had been heavy with rain and lightning storms for 2 of those days. He always calls when he's on a long hike. Always. He hasn't called in 3 days. I just know something is wrong." The brass thought she might be right, or maybe they just got tired of listening to her cry. They told us to spread out and look for the kid, and I think they were hoping for a happy ending. The kid had a bright future, and they wanted to make sure he got to enjoy it. We had 2 rangers out on light duty and another 2 out on vacation, so we were hunting in single-man units. "Presley, you've got the North Woods. Whalen, you've got the Southern Bog. Manderley, you've got the old trail by the homestead. Gavris, you've got the field." I groaned, but Wayland blew out a breath like a disinterested horse. "Quit your belly aching. Least you're not the one that's got to go tromping through the damn bog. I'll never get all the hitchhikers out of my pants cuffs, and I can already feel the inside of my boots getting wet." I realized he was right, but still, the field was massive. The field was a pocket of hay and timothy grass, some of it growing with wild wheat and clover, too. It was thick, and it butted up on the mountain on the southern base. It could be treacherous, and I wasn't looking forward to traveling it on foot until the boss gave us a bit of good news. "Since you're in single-man units, I'm sending you out in bobcats." We whooped happily. Nothing was better than the bobcats. The bobcats were somewhere between a golf cart and an ATV. They ran on diesel and had big all-terrain tires. They weren't very fast, but they were sturdy, and they were better than walking. Suddenly, the field didn't seem so bad. Whalen would have to leave his bobcat on the edge of the bog so he could check it. He told us to go get keys and supplies and warned us to, for God's sake, bring plenty of water. Global warming isn't doing us any favors, people, and it's probably triple digits out there already. Make sure you are hydrated. The last thing I need is one of you dropping out from a heat stroke, so we have to go get you, too. So, we split off, taking the bobcats out to the area around the small mountain range that I will keep unnamed. The field lives up to its name, and if you've never seen a large, undisturbed field of hay or wheat or tall grass, then it probably won't make a lot of sense. It was massive, close to 90 acres, and it swayed placidly. It was like a sea, like an ocean of grass, and it was a little dizzying to look at as I watched it move. I didn't think we'd find him in here. Why would he come in here? But it was worth a look, just in case. I didn't dare drive the bobcat through the grass. That would be a great way to hit a rock and wreck it. So I stuck to the outside of the field and rode the long way around it. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I figured I would know it if I saw it. Maybe Clarence had cut through the field to get away from something, or he'd fallen and been disoriented and gotten lost in the field. Either way, I figured if I was going to see something, it would pop up and make its presence known. A cast-off shoe, some pushed-down grass, an abandoned backpack, something to let me know that he'd been there. I kept driving, eyes focused on the sea of waving grass, and that was how I failed to see the real tire killer of a rock sitting on the edge of the field. I hit it hard enough to nearly flip the buggy over, and when the bobcat began making a god-awful noise and clumping along, I knew I'd shredded a tire. I pulled over, checked the tire, and sure enough, it was popped. I hadn't bent the axle, so that was good, but now I was stuck out in the endless grass field with nothing to do but report what had happened. I hopped on the radio and let dispatch know what I had done, and they told me that it could be an hour before anyone got out there to get me. I groaned, thought about just walking back, and decided it might be a bad idea to just go tromping off in the heat. The bobcat had an air conditioner. Well, it had a fan, and I sat on the front seat and sweated as the fan did very little to keep me cool. This sucked. I was stuck about 10 miles out from the station, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, and it was so hot out. I started drinking the water I had brought, mostly to have something to do, and I think that was the first time I saw it. I was bringing the water bottle up, the water making the things on the other side wavy, and I caught sight of something strange. I expected it to go away as the bottle came back down, just a distortion from the texture of the bottle, but it stayed as the plastic lens came away from my eye. I blinked. Couldn't be what it looked like, but there was nothing else that it could be. It was the top of a lighthouse. I'd seen lighthouses before, but never in person. I'd seen them in pictures and recognized the metal walkway around the top with that big light inside. It wasn't lit, at least it didn't appear to be with the sun overhead, but the thing that held the light was definitely spinning. I don't know the terminology behind a lighthouse, sorry, but I was pretty sure that there wasn't supposed to be one in a field of grass. As hot as it was, I found myself intrigued. I got out of the bobcat and started walking towards it. I stepped into the grass and just let it engulf me as the tower grew closer with every step. I expected it to disappear before I could reach it, some kind of mirage or something, but it just grew out of the tall grass like a tumor. It was made of gray brick, the observation deck up top all black metal and black railing, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger the closer I got. Thunder rumbled suddenly, making my hair stand on end. I jumped when I heard the distant sound of thunder, and that was about the time I realized that the storm clouds were beginning to gather. That wasn't uncommon. It had been thundering and lightninging for the past 2 days, but the sky had been a perfect robin's egg blue before I started the walk towards the lighthouse. The clouds were gathering around it as I came to the base, swirling like they had been called, and as the drops came down, I saw the heavy iron door and made a beeline for it. Luckily, it was unlocked, and I went inside just as the rain started coming down in buckets. I could hear it against the stones of the old lighthouse, and when I turned around, I saw a spiral staircase leading to the observation deck. There wasn't really anything in the lighthouse besides those stairs, so I climbed them. What else was I supposed to do? I somehow knew that I wasn't supposed to go back outside, not just yet, and I kind of wanted to see what the wide field of grass looked like from up there. I climbed for what felt like too long, but I suppose it couldn't have been more than about 10 minutes. There were no windows to let me know how tall the tower was exactly, but as I came to the top, I could swear I heard something other than rain. It sounded like waves were hitting the side of the lighthouse, instead of the thick drops of rain that had been falling when I came in. I came out onto the observation deck and found myself looking down into a sea of grass that was being overtaken by an ocean. The water overtook it, hammering against the lighthouse, and as the grass floated placidly in the water, something moved beneath it. It was huge and glowing, like a worm or some kind of parasite, and it moved through the water like an eel or the long tentacles of a squid. They pulsated like an infected tooth, red and orange and yellow, and as I watched, they spread out to wide corners of the grass field and beyond. The thunder overhead seemed to illuminate it with every strike, and I could see a terrible eye in the middle of its elongated body. The eye was looking at me, and as I backed away from the railing, the drops making circles in the water, I must have tripped because I fell backwards down the stairs. It felt real enough when I hit them, but after a few hard slugs to the head, I passed out, and I have no idea if I ever reached the bottom. I woke up in the infirmary, and the other rangers were pretty happy to see me awake. "We found you on the edge of the grass field. You got dehydrated and fell over. What were you thinking? It's triple digits out there." I tried to tell them about the lighthouse and the glowing thing, but they all just said I must have fallen down and hit my head or something. They say it, but I think the older ones know something. I asked Jacob about it later when I saw him sitting on the porch after dark, and he just shrugged at me. I had told you about the weirdness around here, remember? This place is old, kid, older than any of us. There are things out there that have been here since time was new, and will walk the ashes once we burn it all down. Be glad you discovered something and were allowed to walk away. Not everyone is so lucky. He left not long after, and now I'm sitting on the porch and staring at the stars. I don't know if I feel lucky or not, but I'm glad that whatever lay beneath the water let me go. That damn cat won't stop following me. I looked past John to see that, the warden's ginger cat was looking at him through the doors of the chow hall. The guards were ignoring him, going out of their way to avoid him, and other inmates had taken notice of old One Ear as well. Some of them joked about how fortunate John was to have gotten the attention of the old cat. But for the 7 of us that had been in the tower that day, it was damn creepy. Pete's death was still pretty fresh, so we were all on edge. The heist had been about 2 weeks ago, and we had expected something to be said about the missing pieces. We had expected more searches, inmates being questioned, and even more trips to confinement for some people. We had hidden the things that we would need for the ceremony, but no one had raised any sort of alarm. The day-to-day grind went on, chow, rec, chapel, etc., and we got a little less anxious. Maybe we'd gotten away with it. Maybe he hadn't noticed what we had taken. Charlie doubted it, but Charles wasn't God, and he didn't know everything. Now, that old one-eared Tom was following John. "I don't like it," Marcus said. "That cat saw us in that office. It knows we took things out of there." "Listen to yourself," I challenged. "It's just a cat, Mark. What's it gonna do? Tattle on us?" I expected him to chuckle, maybe realize how nuts he sounded, but he just looked scared, kinda jittery, and glanced around uncertainly. "You weren't here for it, so you wouldn't know. There was a guy, an inmate, who got locked up for murdering a few of his bunkmates, and he swore up and down that the cat had something to do with it. Everyone had seen that cat befriend him. Everyone had seen it following him, and then he got picked up for things out of his control. That cat ain't normal, and it likes the warden a little too much." I looked over at Hadrian, hoping for some help here, but he was no help at all. Hadrian hadn't been his usual self lately, not since he'd found that totem. All he wanted to do was look at it, to hold it, and though it was hard to notice, to quietly talk to it. He seemed to be telling it secrets, things too low for anyone to hear, and I didn't much like it. He kept whispering to it like a kid with a tin can on a string, and it was really freaking me out. "Hadrian," I shouted, pulling him out of his stupor, and he looked lost before smiling dopily. "Gentlemen, all we have to do is maintain the course. Halloween will be here soon, and the veil will be thin enough that we can summon Our Lady." "Halloween? That's not what you said when we stole this stuff. You said the full moon. We can't wait a full month for this. We're already falling apart as it is. Another month would..." But Hadrian turned on me angrily. "Would you prefer to lead this brotherhood? I have gained new information since then, and if we want Jessie at her most powerful, then it has to be Halloween night. If you would prefer to go ahead with it on the full moon and not bring her back properly, then be my guest. But if you want to do it right, then we must wait. It's an extra 3 weeks. Did you have something better to do?" I was taken aback by his aggression and put my hands up defensively. "Whatever you say, boss. I didn't mean any disrespect." But Hadrian had already gone back to looking at the totem, ignoring all of us as he worshipped it with his eyes. It looked as though we would have to keep this on a little longer than expected, and in the meantime, the situation with old One Ear had escalated. He followed John everywhere, through the grounds, to the chow hall, to the rec yard, to the chapel, the place we had our quiet meetings, and even tried to follow him to the dorm. John was absolutely terrified of the cat, getting into trouble more than once for running down the sidewalk instead of walking. The cat seemed to be tailing him, but it wasn't alone. I never saw anyone, but it felt like there were eyes on us, more often than not. Everyone knows that feeling you get, just having someone watch you, and it was exactly like that. The skin on the back of my neck felt like it wanted to crawl up into my hairline, and it got worse as time went on. When I talked to the others about it, they told me they had felt the same. "Except," Frank said, as we sat around our racks that night, "I think I've seen him." "What?" Marcus asked. "You've seen someone watching you?" I don't know, Frank admitted. "It's just a feeling. Have any of you noticed the guy from H-Storm? The new guy? The guy who used to work here?" We all nodded, knowing exactly who he was talking about. The idea that the guy got to live here after working was so ludicrous. Who had thought that was a good idea? He would know how to work the keys, all the radio codes, the layout of the prison, and a lot of other information that could get him over the gates if he really wanted to. We had all seen the guy coming and going from the chow hall or on the rec yard, but he really didn't appear to be anything special. The strange thing was that he didn't seem to be tied to any particular dorm, not like his peers were. He had an odd sort of freedom when it came to the compound, and it allowed him to be places that he shouldn't be. "Has he said anything to you?" Marcus asked. "Has he said anything that makes you believe he knows what we're doing?" "He hasn't said anything yet, but he looks at me like he..." Frank struggled to come up with something and finally settled on the truth. "He looks at me like the judge looks at you when he knows just what you did." We all looked at Marcus, someone who had become our rock in Hadrian's absence, and he said that he would talk to him. I woke up 2 days later to the sound of people yelling and loud voices telling us to sit down and shut up. We were all on our bunks, the hour still pretty early, and as I looked around, I noticed one of our group was missing. John's bunk was empty, the covers messy, looking like someone had just gotten up for a minute and meant to come right back. I looked at Marcus, but he just shook his head. The guards by the door didn't move, but people came and went through the side door. We couldn't see the bathroom. None of us were allowed to leave our racks. But when they wheeled a gurney out through the side door, I had a pretty good view of it. Whoever was on the stretcher wasn't coming back, it seemed, and the nurses and guards around them weren't taking vitals or attempting CPR. They had zipped him into a bag, which meant he was a little beyond a medical call-out. The guards that hadn't gone with them filed in, and I could see Sergeant McCowan, the yard's latest hard-ass, standing at the tip of the spear. "Okay, ladies, boxers and t-shirts at the end of your beds, and don't say a goddamn word. Failure will result in a trip to the box. Do it, now." We complied, and they started searching our stuff. They pulled us aside a few at a time, searching our stuff when we stood there, and sending us to the day room once they were satisfied. They were being less than careful with our stuff, dumping it on the bed or tossing it onto the floor, and whatever they were looking for, it must have been important. Fortunately, the guard who came to search Hadrian's things was one of ours, and when Officer Gabrius came to search my bunk, he winked before beginning his search. "What happened?" I asked, side-mouthed, as he pretended to search. "Your friend John was murdered," he whispered back. "Someone cut his throat in the shower and left him there to bleed out. The guy in the dorm didn't find him until about 20 minutes ago, and it looks really bad." I was about to ask him more, but McCowan came by then, and Gabriel shut his mouth and finished his search. "Okay, inmate, head to the day room," he barked, moving on to the next one as McCowan nodded and wandered off. Soon, the 6 of us that remained were all in the day room, the metal benches cold against our bare legs as we talked about what we'd learned. John had been killed sometime in the wee hours. He'd gotten up to go to the bathroom right after 3 o'clock count, and someone had drug him into the shower, slit his throat, and let him bleed out right there on the floor behind the privacy wall. No one noticed until about 30 minutes ago when the dorm officer had come out to do a round. The response had been quick, but by the time they got there, the killer had likely been long gone. In the absence of a suspect, they had decided to turn the whole dorm upside down, but no one had found anything incriminating. No homemade knife, no bloody uniform, nothing. It was as if John's throat had just opened itself up, and he had bled out behind the privacy wall in a filthy prison shower. Just as the sun began to rise, our breakfast postponed until something could be discovered. We had a very special guest. They sent us back to stand in front of our racks, and the placement of guards told me they were expecting trouble. They needn't have. All of us were tired, hungry, and confused, and that would have made for a lackluster riot. Also, I think we all sensed that the someone in question was not someone to be messed with, and that feeling proved to be right. The warden came in, looking resplendent in his pinstripe suit, and smiled at us all in a fatherly way that let us know that he wasn't mad, just disappointed. "I understand that one of your bunkmates was killed this morning. I'm fully aware that you all have this code of honor or whatever, but if any of you have any information, it would be greatly appreciated if you came forward. Any information on any crime committed within the perimeter would be greatly appreciated. Just let your dorm officer know that you need to speak with me, and I'll be happy to take your statement. Don't worry about the time either," he said, his smile too large as it threatened to take in his ears. "I'm always here." He left us then, and we were all left to look at each other in the wake of this departure. We understood fully. He knew that someone had taken his things. He knew where they were, and he intended to get them one way or another. We were down to 6, but how many more could we lose before the cracks really began to show? Dad was always kind of a weird guy. Weird and strict. I always thought it was just because he was a single parent, but even that seemed to only barely cover his odd behavior. He expected the best of me, expected my chores to be done, expected the rules to be followed, and if I didn't, there was only one punishment that would do. Dad never hit me with a belt. He never spanked me with his hand. He never took my stuff or put me in time out. No, Dad had a different sort of punishment he used. He didn't introduce the jar until I was 6, and it was revealed with a lot of serious contemplation. I remember coming home from my first day of kindergarten and finding Dad sitting in the living room, the jar on the little end table where the magazines and the rickrack usually stood. The jar may have begun life as a pickle jar. It always smelled a little briny, and inside were beans. They were spotted pinto beans, the kind I had used on art projects and crafts since before I could remember, and I noticed that they had been filled up to the brim. All in all, there were probably about 3 bags of beans in there, and a piece of scotch tape declared it to be my jar. "Take a seat. We need to have a serious talk," he said, and I ended up just sitting on the floor of our living room and looking up at him. He looked very serious, more serious than I'd ever seen him before, and that scared me a bit. Up until now, Dad had always been this goofy guy who played pirates and astronauts and Mario Kart with me. But now he looked like a judge, ready to sentence me to death if I didn't have a pretty good defense for my crimes. "You're 6 now, long past knowing right from wrong. In this family, it's customary to use the bean jar to punish children. Do you see this jar?" He asked it like there was any way I could miss it. I nodded and he smiled, seeming pleased. "The bean jar symbolizes you. It's everything you are and everything you might be. So from now on, when you're bad or insolent or you disobey my orders, I will not yell at you or send you to your room. I won't do anything but take a bean from the bean jar." I almost laughed. Was this a game or something? Was I supposed to be scared of a jar of beans? This had to be another one of Dad's jokes. Dad was always doing stuff like this, telling me how the monsters in my closet could be kept away by a teddy bear, or that the cavity creeps would eat my teeth if I didn't brush them twice a day. Dad was a goofball. He had always been a goofball, but I think it was his face that made me wonder if he was joking or not. Throughout the whole thing, he just sat there, deadly serious, and never averted his eyes from me. "You're a smart kid, just like I was. I see now that you'll need an example. You may think this is just a regular jar, but you're wrong." He reached in and picked up a bean. Dead wrong. He didn't even take it out. He just lifted a little, hovering it over the pile. But he didn't need to do anything else. Suddenly, miraculously, it felt like someone was touching my brain. It was the feeling of getting a sudden sadness, a sudden bit of anxiety, and I wanted him to drop that bean back into the jar. I needed to be whole. I needed all my beans, and he must have seen that on my face, because he dropped it back in, and I trembled as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. "I'm sorry, but you have to know what's at stake here. You're my last chance. I have to make sure that you're perfect. And the bean jar knows perfection from flaw. My own father used this method, and his father before him. The bean jar is always used until the child's 18th birthday, or until all the beans are gone." I was panting when I asked him what would happen if all the beans were gone. He looked at me without mirth, without any sign of a joke or a goof. "You don't want to know." That was how it started with the bean jar. Dad didn't suddenly turn into an ogre or become a villain overnight. He went back to being the same guy he'd always been. We would play video games together, build with my Legos, play pretend after school. My dad had never scared me like that before. He and I were always really close, but I remember how he would get when he had to take beans out of the jar. His face would become completely neutral, and he would walk to the jar and take out a bean before crushing it between his thumb and forefinger. The bean jar was utilized even for the most trivial of infractions. Forgot to wash my dish? Lose a bean. Forgot to put my clothes away? Lose a bean. Stayed up too late on a school night? Lose a bean. There was no escalation either. There was never any difference between forgetting to clean up my toys or yelling at Dad because I was frustrated. It was always one bean at a time, ground to dust between his large, calloused fingers. He would look at me, too, with this mixture of pain and resolve once it was done, his stoicism only going so far. Those times he took a bean, however, were unbearable. It felt as if each bean was a piece of my psyche, and he was turning it to dust. As a child, every bean made me hyper-aware of my actions, but I was still just a child. Sometimes I forgot things. Sometimes I was lazy. Sometimes I thought I could sneak around and get away with not doing what I was told. I was always caught, always punished, and I always fell into a state of anxious, nervous emotions once it was done. I hated the way it felt when he crushed those beans, and I didn't want to lose another one. I didn't want to lose them so badly that I trained myself to perform the task expected of me without fail. 5 a.m., start the laundry. 5:20, make breakfast. 5:30, wash my dishes. 5:40, dress. 6 o'clock, clean up my room. 6:30, backpack on, fully dressed, waiting by the door to leave. 3:10, get home, do my homework. 4:30, clean the house. 5, start dinner. 6, eat dinner when my father got home. 9 o'clock, brush teeth, take shower. 9:30, bedtime. Every day, without fail, these things were done, or I would be one bean the shorter. This manifested itself into a kind of mania in me. Not only did I have to get all my chores done, but I needed to get good grades too. After a while, good wasn't good enough. What if Dad decided that C's and B's weren't good enough? I strove for all A's, and Dad seemed happy with my efforts. To the other kids, however, I was a weirdo. I didn't really have any friends. Dad was my only friend, but it was a strange kind of friendship, like living with someone who has schizophrenia and could change at the slightest inclination. I didn't have any real friends, not till high school, when I met Cass. Cassandra Bigley was not what you would consider a model student. Her parents had high expectations for her, but she was middling at best. She came to me because I was the smartest kid in school, at least according to the other kids, and she begged me to help her. I helped her, I tutored her, showed her the way, and soon her grades improved. That was how we became friends, how she was the first one to find out about the bean jar. So, what? He just takes out a bean and crushes it? Yes, I said, not sounding at all mystified about the process. And what? I mean, you have less beans? I thought about it. Dad had never actually told me what would happen, only that it would be terrible. When he takes out all the beans, then something awful will happen. Like what? No dessert for a month? I don't know, but I know that when he crushes those beans, it's It's like a piece of my sanity is mushed. I feel crazy after he smushes a bean. I don't like feeling that way. I don't like it at all. I started crying. I hadn't meant to. I was 16 and I never cried anymore. But Cass didn't make me feel bad about it. She just held me while I cried, and eventually I stopped. It had felt good to be held. Dad hugged me, but he never comforted me. I didn't have a mom, someone whose job seemed to be comforting me. And as Cass held me, I realized what I had been missing all these years. I had been missing a mom that I had never even known. We hung out a lot after that, Cass and I. Despite our age, it was never inappropriate. She gave me something I'd been missing, a friend without the threat of punishment looming over our relationship. The realization made me feel different about my dad. He was still the lovable goofball that he had always been, but I started to see how our entire relationship hung under the shadow of that bean jar. As I pulled away, he became more sullen, more suspicious, and I saw him holding the bean jar sometimes as if he wished to smash them. If I wasn't misbehaving, though, he couldn't. That was always the deal, and he knew it. I knew it, and he knew that as long as I abided by the rules, he couldn't punish me. Despite how it will sound, Dad was never cruel about the bean jar. He never used it to take out his frustration. He never came home and punished me simply because he had had a bad day. The rules were established. We had both agreed to them, and I knew that by following them, I could be safe. I think, deep down, Dad really did think he was doing the best for me, thought he was molding me into something better than I could be. And I guess he was right, though it wasn't fair. Not really. Then, one day, after coming home from Cass's, it all came to a head. Dad was supposed to be at work, so Cass and I came back to the house to play video games. She had never even seen a Super Nintendo, and she wanted to play some Mario Kart with me. We had come in, laughing and making jokes, when someone cleared their throat loudly, sending a chill up my spine and turning me slowly toward my dad. He was sitting on the couch. He looked so much like he had the day that he had introduced the bean jar, and he was wearing that look of pain and resolve. You come home late, your chores aren't done, your homework is undone, and you've brought someone here without my permission. Why have you decided to break the rules like this? I saw the hammer come down on the table, but I hadn't realized what he'd done until then. It turned the bean that he had laid there into smithereens, and I shuddered as I gripped my head and moaned. If he noticed, he made no comment. He just brought the hammer down on another one, and I nearly vomited as a pain like no other went through me. He had lined up 4, one for each infraction, but he had never done anything like this before. It had always been one at a time, and that had been bad enough. This, however, was unbearable. Stop it, Cass yelled. Whatever you're doing to him, stop. But he cut her off. He grabbed her under the arm and heaved her towards the door. This is your fault. You've changed him, made him forget his purpose, but I won't let you kill him. You aren't allowed in this house. Never again. And I put her down, I growled, finding my feet and weaving only a little. You will not touch her. My father looked at me, not believing what he was hearing. Put her down now, I repeated, stepping up close and getting in his face. You dare to challenge me? You're no different than the rest. I tried to raise you better, but it appears I was a fool. I'll smash every damn bean in that jar if I have to. When all the beans are gone, you'll cease to exist. I'll smash every damn bean in that jar just to prove... Just to prove... But he never finished. He let go of the hammer as he clutched at his chest, and it fell from his grip as he grasped at his shirt front. His face had gone from red to purple, and before he hit the ground, it was nearly black. I just stood there for a moment, listening to Cass beat on the door and ask what was wrong. I couldn't answer. I just stood there, feeling like I was suffocating as the realization that my father was dead fell across me. That was 2 years ago. I've been living with Cass since then, her parents taking me in gladly. Cass and I are getting ready for college, and that's when I remembered the house. It's still there, still sitting on the same lot, and I decided that it might be good to sell it so I can pay tuition. There were things inside as well. I've been back a few times to get things, and I knew my father's room was essentially untouched. The police hadn't bothered to search the place. Dad's death was no mystery, after all, and they decided that he had died of a heart attack and saved me a lengthy interrogation. I started cleaning it out as summer began, selling what I could and donating what I couldn't. I found pictures of my dad and I, taken in better times, and far too soon I'd cleaned out everything and was left with only my father's room. I paused at the door, almost feeling like a burglar when I thought about going in there. But finally I decided that this was my house now, and this room was as good as mine too. The room was Spartan, a bed and a dresser and a closet, but it was what I found inside that took me by surprise. 5 jars, each of them bearing a different name. Jacob, Mark, Sylvester, Katie, and James. They were empty, the lids gone, and the taped-on names made them look exactly like mine. What the hell was this? Who were these people? I didn't know any of them, and no one but Dad and I had ever lived in the house. It had always been just the two of us. Always just... No. But no, that couldn't be true, because my mother had once lived with us. There in the back was a 6th jar, the glass broken, but the tape intact. Maggie. When the beans are gone, I heard Dad's voice echo in my head, then you cease to exist. Had the names on those jars been real people? Had I lived with them and simply didn't remember them? How could you remember people who never existed? I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it all, and finally decided to write this before it gets unclear. Apparently Dad wasn't as crazy as I might have thought, and maybe I should have been more respectful of the bean jar. It sits on the shelf in my dorm room now. I took it from the house before I sold it, and I guard it jealously. I don't know if it still works the same now that Dad is dead, but I'm not taking any chances. Charles stepped into Funland Amusement and ground his teeth at the sight of children playing skee-ball and air hockey and the waka 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 of Pac-Man that filled the air. The Great Gizmo, reduced to playing chess in a place like this. The owner started to say something to the well-dressed gentleman, but Charles waved him off. He didn't need directions. He and Gizmo were old friends, and he could practically smell the old gypsy from here. That was one of those words his great-great-grandchildren would have told him was a cancelable offense, but Charles didn't care. Much like the Great Gizmo, Charles was from a different age. Charles had first met Gizmo in 1919, when the world was still new and things made sense. It had been at an expo in Coney Island, and his father had been rabid to see it. "They say it's from Europe, and it's been touring since the 1800s. It's supposed to play chess like a grandmaster, Charlie boy, and they claim it's never been beaten. I want you to be the first one to do it, kiddo." Charlie's father had been a trainman, an engineer, and a grease monkey who had never gotten farther than the 5th grade. He had learned everything he knew at the side of better men, but he knew Charlie was special. Charles was 9 and already doing high school math, and not just reading Shakespeare, but understanding what he meant, doing numbers good enough to get a job at the broker's house if he wanted it. His father wouldn't hear of it, though. No genius son of his was going to run numbers for bingo boys, not when he could get an education and get away from this cesspool. "Education, Charlie, that's what's going to lift you above the rest of us. Higher learning is what's going to get you a better life than your old man." One thing his dad did love, though, was chess. Most of the train guys knew the typical games: cards, dice, checkers, chess. But Charlie's dad had loved the game best of all. He was no grand master, barely above a novice, but he had taught Charles everything he knew about it from a very young age. Charles had absorbed it like a sponge. He was one of the best in the boroughs, maybe one of the best in the city, and he'd taken 3rd in the Central Park chess finals just last year. "And that was against guys 3 times your age, kid," his dad had crowed. Now, he wanted his son to take on the Great Gizmo. The exhibition was taking place in a big tent not far from the show hall, and it was standing room only. Lots of people wanted to see this machine that could beat a man at chess, and they all wanted a turn to try it out. Most of them wouldn't, Charlie knew, but they wanted the chance to watch it beat better men than them so they could feel superior for a little while. Charles didn't intend to give them the satisfaction. The man who'd introduced the thing was dressed in a crisp red and white striped suit, his flat-topped hat making him look like a carnival barker. He had thumped his cane and called the crowd to order, his eyes roving the men and women as if searching for the right victim. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I have here is the most amazing technical marvel of the last century. He has bested kings, geniuses, and politicians in the art of chess, and is looking for his next challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Great Gizmo." Charles hadn't been terribly impressed when the man tore back the tarp to reveal the thing. It looked like a fortune teller, dressed in a long red robe with a turban on its head, boasting a tall feather and a large gem with many facets. It had a beard, a long mustachio that dripped with rings and bells, and a pair of far too expressive eyes. It moved jerkily, like something made of wires, and the people oohed and awed over it, impressed. "Now then, who will be the first to test its staggering strategy? Only $5 for the chance to best the Great Gizmo." Charlie's father had started to step forward, but Charles put a hand on his arm. "Let's watch for a moment, Dad. I want to see how he plays." "You sure? I figured you'd stomp it first, and then we'd walk off with the glory." "I'm sure," Charles said, standing back to watch as the first fellow approached, paying his money and taking a seat. This was how Charles liked to play. First came the observation period, where he watched and made plans. He liked to stand back, blending in with the crowd so he could take the measure of his opponents. People rarely realized you were studying their moves, planning counter moves, and when you stepped up and trounced them, they never saw it coming. That was always his favorite part, watching their time-tested strategies fall apart as they played on and destroyed themselves by second-guessing their abilities. That hadn't happened that day in the tent at Coney Island. As much as he watched, and as much as he learned, Charles never quite understood the strategies at play with the Great Gizmo. He stuck to no gambits, he initiated no set strategy, and he was neither aggressive nor careful. He answered their moves with the best counter move available every time, and he never failed to thwart them. After 5 others had been embarrassed, to the general amusement of the crowd, Charles decided it was his turn. "A kid?" the barker asked. "Mister, I'll take your money, but I hate to steal from a man." His father had puffed up at that. "Charlie's a chess prodigy. He'll whip your metal man." And so, Charles took his seat, setting eye to glass eye with the thing, and the game began. Charles would play a lot of chess in his lifetime, but he would never play a game quite that one-sided again. The Great Gizmo thwarted him at every move, countered his counters, ran circles around him, and by the end, Charles wasn't sure he had put up any sort of fight at all. He had a middling collection of pieces, barely anything, and Gizmo had everything. "Checkmate," the thing had rasped, its voice full of secret humor, and Charles had nodded before walking away in defeat. "No sweat, Charlie boy," his father had assured him. "Damn creepy thing's a cheat anyway. That's what it is, just a cheatin' bit of nothing." Charles hadn't said anything, but he had made a vow to beat the pile of wires next time the chance arose. Charles saw the Great Gizmo sitting in the back of the arcade, forgotten and unused. He didn't know how much the owner had paid for it, but he doubted it was making it back. The Great Gizmo was a relic. No one came to the arcade to play chess anymore. There was a little placard in front of him telling his history, and a sign that asked patrons not to damage the object. The camera overhead likely helped with that, but there was likely more to it than that. The Great Gizmo looked like something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of this uncanny valley that his great-grandson talked about sometimes, and people found it off-putting. Charles, however, was used to it. "Do you remember me?" he asked, putting a quarter in as the thing shuddered and seemed to look up at him. Its robes were faded, its feather ragged, but its eyes were still intelligent. "Charles," it croaked, just as it had on that long-ago day. Charles had been in his 2nd year of high school when he met the Great Gizmo for the 2nd time. School was more of a formality than anything. He could pass any test that a college entrance board could throw at him, but they wouldn't give him the chance until he had a diploma. He was 16, a true prodigy now, and his chess skills had only increased over the years. He had taken Ruby Fawn to the fair that year, and that was where he saw the sign proclaiming the Great Gizmo would be in attendance. He had drugged her over to the tent, the girl saying that she didn't want to see that creepy old thing, but he wanted a second chance at it. His father was still working in the grease pits of the train yard, but he knew his face would light up when he heard how his son had bested his old chess rival. The stakes had increased in 7 years, it seemed. It was now $8 to play the champ, but the winner got a $50 cash prize. $50 was a lot of money in 1926. But Charles wanted the satisfaction of besting this thing more than anything. Despite what his father wanted, he had been running numbers for John McClure and his gang for over a year, and some well-placed bets had left him flush with cash. "Good luck, young man," said the Barker, and Charles was surprised to find that it was the same Barker as before. Time had not been kind to him. His suit was now faded, his hat frayed around the rim, and he'd put on weight which bulged around the middle and made the suit roll, spoiling the uniform direction of the stripes. Despite that, it was still him, and he grinned at Charles as he took his familiar seat. This time, the match was a little different. Charles had increased in skill, and he saw through many of the traps Gizmo set for him. The audience whispered quietly behind him, believing that the Great Gizmo had met his match, but the real show was just beginning. Charles had taken several key pieces, and as he took a second look, the thing's eyes sparkled, and it bent down as if to whisper something to him. The crowd would not have heard it. Its voice was too low, but the Great Gizmo whispered a secret to Charles that would stick with him forever. "Charles, this will not be our last game. We will play 8 more times before the end." It was given in a tone of absolute certainty, not an offhanded statement made to get more of Charles's hard-earned money. Charles looked mystified, not sure if he had actually heard what the thing had said, and it caused him to flub his next move and lose a piece he had not wanted to. Charles persevered, however, pressing on and taking more pieces, and just as he believed that victory was within his grasp, the thing spoke again. "Charles, you will live far longer than you may wish to." Again, it was spoken in that tone of absolute assuredness, and it caused Charles to miss what would have been obvious. The Great Gizmo won after 2 more moves, and Charles was again defeated. "Better luck next time," said the Barker, and even Charles's date told him that he had done really well. Charles knew that he would never be great until he beat this machine, though. The pieces appeared. Charles set his up, and they began what would be their 4th game. Charles, strategically meeting the machine's offensive plays with his own practiced gambits, would gladly admit that the 3 games he had played against the Great Gizmo had improved his chess game more than any other matches he had ever played. Charles had faced old-timers in the park, grand masters at chess tournaments, and everything in between. Despite it all, the Great Gizmo never ceased to amaze and test his skill. Charles tried not to think of that last match. It was a match where Charles had done the one thing he promised he would never do. He had cheated. The Great Gizmo had become something of a mania in him after he had lost to it a second time. He'd gone to college, married his sweetheart, and began a job that paid well and wasn't terribly difficult. With his business acumen, Charles had been placed as the manager of a textile mill. Soon, he had bought it and was running the mill himself. Charles had turned the profits completely around after he had purchased the mill, seeing what the owner was doing wrong and fixing it when the mill belonged to him. He'd come a long way from the little kid who sat in the tent at Coney Island, but that tent was never far from his mind. Charles had one obsession, and it was chess. Even his father had told him he took the game far too seriously. He and his father still played at least twice a week, and it was mostly a chance for the two to talk. His father was not able to work the train yard anymore. He lost a leg to one of the big locomotives when it had fallen out of the hoist onto him, but that hardly mattered. His father lived at the home that Charles shared with his wife, a huge mansion on the main street of town, and his days were spent at leisure now. "You're the best chess player I've ever met, Charlie, but you take it too seriously. It's just a game, an entertainment, but you treat every chess match like a war." Charles would laugh when he said these things, but his father was right. Every chess match was a war, and the general behind all those lesser generals was the Great Gizmo. He had seen the old golem in various fairs and sideshows, but he had resisted the urge to go and play again. He couldn't beat him, not yet, and when he did play him, he wanted to be ready. He had studied chess the way some people study law or religion. He knew everything, at least everything that he could learn from books and experience, but it appeared he had one more teacher to take instruction from. Charles liked to go to the park and play against the old-timers that stayed there. Some of them had been playing chess longer than he'd been alive, and they had found ways to bend or even break the established rules of strategy. On the day in question, he was playing against a young black man. He called himself Kenny, and when he had taken Charles's rook, something strange happened. The rook was gone, but so had his knight that had been beside it. Charles knew the knight had been there, but when he looked across the board, he saw that it was sitting beside the rook on Kenny's side. He still won the match. Charles was at a point where he could win with nearly any 4 pieces on the board, but when they played again, he reached out and caught Kenny by the wrist as he went to take his castle off the board. In his hand was a pawn as well, and Kenny grinned like it was all a big joke. Charles wasn't mad, though. On the contrary. The move had been so quick, so smooth, that he hadn't even seen it the first time. He wondered if it would work for a creature that did not possess sight. It might be just the edge that he was looking for. "Hey, man, we ain't playing for money or nothing. There's no need to get upset over it." "Show me," Charles asked, and Kenny was more than happy to oblige. Kenny showed him the move, telling him the piece he palmed always had to be on the right of the piece that you would take. If it's on the left, they focus on that piece. If it's on the right, though, then the piece is practically hidden by the one you just put down. You can't hesitate. It's got to be a smooth move. But if you're quick enough, and you're sure enough, it's damn near undetectable. Charles practiced the move for hours, even using it against his own father, something he felt guilty about. He could do it without hesitation, without being noticed, and he was proud of his progress, despite the trickery. He was practicing it for 2 years before he got the chance to take on the Great Gizmo again. By then, Charles was a master of not just chess, but of that little sleight of hand. He hadn't dared use it at any of the chess tournaments. The refs were just too vigilant, as were the players. But in casual games, as well as at the park, he had become undetectable by any but the most observant. He was good enough to do it without hesitation, and when he opened his paper and saw a squib that the Great Gizmo would be at Coney Island that weekend, right before going overseas for a 10-year tour, he knew this would be his chance. There was no fee to play against it this time. The barker was still there, but he looked a little less jolly these days. He was an old, fat man who had grown sour and less jovial. He looked interested in being gone from here, in getting to where he would be paid more for the show. He told Charles to take a spot in line, and as the players took their turns, many of them people Charles had bested already, they were quickly turned away with a defeat at the hands of the golem. The Great Gizmo looked downright dapper as he sat there, seeing that the man had gotten him a new robe and a feather for his journey. The eyes still sparkled knowingly, however, and Charles settled himself so as not to be thrown by any declaration of future knowledge this time. The pieces came out, and the game began. Charles did well at first. He was cutting a path through the Great Gizmo's defenses, and the thing again told him they would play 8 more times before the end. That was a constant, it seemed, but after that, the match turned ugly. The Great Gizmo recaptured some of his pieces and set them to burning. Charles was hurting, but still doing well. He took a few more, received his next expected bit of prophecy, and then the play became barbaric. The Great Gizmo was playing very aggressively, and Charles had to maneuver himself to stay one step ahead of the thing. He became desperate, trying to get the old golem into position, and when he saw the move, he took it. He had palmed a knight and a pawn when something unexpected happened. The Great Gizmo grabbed his hand, just as he had grabbed Kenny's, and it leaned down until its eyes were inches from his. It breathed out, its breath full of terrible smoke and awful prophecy, and Charles began to choke. The smoke filled his mouth, taking his breath, and he blacked out as he fell sideways. The thing let go of him as he fell, but his last image of the Great Gizmo was of its 2 expressive eyes watching him with disappointment. He'd been found wanting again, and Charles wondered before passing out if there would be a 4th time. Charles woke up 3 days later in the hospital, his wife rejoicing that God had brought him back to them. By then, the Great Gizmo was on a boat to England, out of his reach. The year after that, World War II would erupt, and Charles had feared that he would never get another match with this creature. The match began as it always did. Charles put aside the Great Gizmo's gambits, one at a time. He played brilliantly, thwarting the golem's best defenses, and then it came time to attack. He cut the Great Gizmo to shreds, his line all a tatter, and when he told him that they would play 8 games before the end, Charles knew he was advancing well. He had lost barely any pieces of his own, and as the thing began to set its later plans in order, he almost laughed. This was proving to be too easy. The Great Gizmo and the Barker had been in Poland when it fell to the Blitzkrieg, and the Great Gizmo had dropped off the face of the earth for a while. Charles had actually enlisted after Pearl Harbor, but not for any sense of patriotism. He had a mania growing in him, and it had been growing for years. He knew where the thing had last been, and he meant that he would find the Barker and his mysterious machine. The Army was glad to have him, and his time in college made it easy to become an officer after basic training. They offered him a desk job, something in shipping, but he turned them down. If he wanted to find the Great Gizmo, he would have to go to war. He had fought at Normandy and Paris and 100 other skirmishes, and that was where he discovered something astounding. Despite the danger that Charles put himself in, he didn't die. Charles was never more than slightly wounded, a scratch or a bruise, but sustained no lasting damage. He wondered how this could be, but then he remembered the words of the Great Gizmo. "You will live far longer than you may wish to." He returned home after the war, but the old construct never returned to America. It took a while for his contacts to get back on their feet, but eventually what he got were rumors and hearsay. He heard that Hitler had taken the thing, adding it to his collection of objects he believed to be supernatural. He heard it had been destroyed in a bombing run over Paris. He heard one of MacArthur's generals had taken it as the spoil of war, and many other unbelievable things. After the war, it was supposed to have been taken to Jordan, then to Egypt, to Russia, to South Africa, and finally back to Europe. But he never could substantiate these things. And all the while, Charles grew older, less sturdy, but he never died. He was over 100 years old now, 106 to be precise, but he could pass for a robust 50 most of the time. He had buried his wife, all 3 of his children, 2 of his grandchildren as well. He'd lost his youngest son to Vietnam and his oldest grandson to the Iraq War. He was trying to keep his great-grandson from enlisting. They all seemed to want to follow in his footsteps, but they couldn't grasp that he had not done this for his country. "Checkmate," he spat viciously as he conquered his old rival. He had gone to war not for his wife or the baby in her arms, or even for the one holding her hand. He had gone to war for this metal monstrosity and the evil prophecy that it held. "Well played," it intoned, and he hated the sense of pride that filled him at those words. "You may ask one question, any question, and I will answer it for you. You have defeated the Great Gizmo, and now the secrets of the universe are open to you." Some men would have taken this chance to learn the nature of time, the identity of God, maybe even the night's lotto numbers, but there was only one question that interested Charles. "How much longer will I live?" The Great Gizmo sat back a little, seeming to contemplate the question. "You will live for as long as there is a Great Gizmo. Our lives are connected by fate, and we shall exist together until we do not." Charles thought about that for a long time, though he supposed he had known all along what the answer would be. The man behind the counter looked startled when the old man approached him and asked to buy the Great Gizmo. "That old thing?" he asked, not quite believing it. "It's an antique, buddy. I picked it up in Maine, hoping it would draw in some extra customers, but it never did. Thing creeps people out." "It creeps me out, too, if I'm being honest. I guess I'd sell it to you for $1,500. That's what I paid for it, and I'd like to get at least what I paid back for the damn thing." Charles brought out a money clip and peeled $2,000 bills from it. He handed them to the man, saying he would have men here to collect it within the hour. "Hey, pal, you paid me too much. I only wanted—" "The rest is a bonus for finding something I've searched for my whole life." He called the men he had hired to move the thing and stayed there until they had it secured on the truck. Charles had a spot at the house for it, a room of other treasures that he had found while looking for the old golem. The walls were fire retardant, the floor was concrete, the ceiling was perfectly set to never fall or shift. Charles had been keeping a spot for the Great Gizmo for years, and now he would keep him and himself for as long as forever would last. Or at least, he reflected, for 4 more chess matches. Wasn't that what the Great Gizmo had promised him, after all? It was just starting to feel like autumn, and that's what I'll always remember about that day. The leaves were still half green, the gold just starting to emerge, and that time of year always reminds me of that day. Our boss, Carl Boswick, was not what you would call a smart man. He was greedy, he was ambitious, he could be cruel, and he was certainly lazy. But smart? No, not a day in his life. He had been talking with the mayor, unbeknownst to us, and the 10 of us who made up his crew arrived that day to find Mayor Horace Dewey and Boswick waiting for us in the yard. I wasn't a crew boss back then. I was just another lumberman, and your dad and I were on the Deepwoods crew. We had both served in Vietnam, but there had been no ticker-tape parade when we came back. We are, pretty good friends, and we watched each other's backs when we came into the woods. There were 5 Deepwoods crews in those days, but we were regarded as the best of those 5. We lost the fewest men, we cut the most lumber, we brought the most wood back to the mill. We were the best, and that was why he chose us. He wanted men who could get the job done, but I don't think even he knew what the job was. Men, I want to enlist your help for a special job today. Mr. Boswick and I have been talking, and I want to put an end to this forester nonsense. The uproar was immediate and not particularly productive. We had all grown up with the rules too, and we knew that you did not fight against the foresters. You stayed still, you hid, but you didn't fight them. They couldn't be fought as far as we knew. But Dewey quieted us as best he could. I know, this is not how things are normally done, but I know that if anyone can accomplish this, it's the brave men who go into the deep woods. I'm going into the deep woods to attack the heart of the foresters. Come with me, and I'll make sure that each of you are rewarded handsomely. Handsomely turned out to be a year's worth of wages when we succeeded. This was 95. That kind of money could change your life. People were working paycheck to paycheck, and a sum like that could pay off a mortgage, a couple of cars, settle debts, or even help someone start a new life. We agreed to a man, even me, and headed into the woods to earn our reward. You've never seen the deep woods, I assume, and I'm betting your old man doesn't talk about it much. The woods have 3 stages. There's the outskirts, where we work, the mids, where the regular logging crews work, and the deep woods, where the experienced guys go. We were heading deeper than that. We were heading into the heart of Rayffered Woods. This was where Mayor Dewey assured us the foresters made their home. I've been going over the old town documents, he told us as we rode into the deep woods, and I have discovered a way to get rid of them for good. The foresters have a tree that lies in the middle of their camp, a heart tree, and within it lies the thing that gives the foresters their power. We're going to destroy it, and once it's gone, the foresters will be gone too. And how do you propose to just walk into a forester camp? Said your father, bold as brass. We have enough trouble dodging them in the open. I can't imagine trying to sneak into a group of them. Oh no, they won't be at their camp, he assured us. You sound pretty sure of that, your dad said. Do they have an appointment or something? He asked, drawing chuckles from the rest. Nope, Dewey said, the truck coming to a stop. They're going to be too busy putting out fires. We'd stopped next to an area in the woods near the midpoint, a place where we often cut. The stumps were thick out here, but some of them already had sprouts growing from them. Pretty soon, there would be new trees for us to harvest, but I'd never see them reach maturity. I never questioned then why the forest grew so quickly, but I suppose in retrospect it should have seemed off. The trees in Rayffered return as quickly as they fall, and the children are the price we pay. We'd been riding in Boswick's extended cab dually, and the back could easily fit about 4 people. The other 6 had been riding in the back of the truck, the mayor and Boswick in the front, but the guys in the bed hadn't been riding alone. There were 3 large somethings under a tarp, and when we stopped, we learned what was under there. Mayor Dewey put a foot on the tire and stepped up and into the back of the truck. We all knew Dewey. He'd been a logging man too, once upon a time, and it had earned him the votes of a lot of roughnecks. He had promised change, but I don't think we understood how much change he meant to bring. The guys in the back looked at him as he smiled, whipping the tarp off like a magician doing a trick, and revealed 3 drums, 2 of acetone, 1 of benzene, and he told the guys in the back to unload them carefully. He stood there and watched as they put him down, most of them not sure what was going on. but I'd figured it out. I'd been responsible for munitions in the service before I got out. Munitions and chemical storage. I knew how volatile those 3 drums could be. I thought I had an idea what he intended to do, but I prayed I was wrong. "This is how we will draw them out," he said, and even Boswick looked shocked. "Mayor," I said, finding my courage, "I really hope you don't intend to set those off in the forest." "But of course," Dewey said, popping the lid on one of them. "Even school children know not to set fires, or you'll attract the wrath of the foresters. I'm going to rig up a fuse," he said, taking out a length of fabric, "and we'll be on our way before it goes off." We all stood a little straighter, our neck hair up. Setting a fire in the deep woods? He might as well have said that we were going to take a dump on the altar of the Baptist church. None of us could have said why, but lighting a fire in the deep woods was as close to blasphemy as we could think. It wasn't just that it would make the foresters angry, but the deep woods were a place that felt ancient and sacred. I had been in the deep woods since coming back from war at 22, and the feeling of being there was like what I imagined standing at Stonehenge is like. You are a tiny thing standing in the lap of something that was ancient when you were born and will not mourn you when you die. I looked around and realized that all of us felt that way, and they looked as furious as I was. "Mayor," I said, but your dad cut me off. If I was furious, then he was livid. "You can't do that. Are you insane? You'll bring their wrath down on the whole town. They take whole logging camps for brush fires sometimes, for lightning strike blazes. If you set that off in the deep woods, they'll kill us all." Dewey looked up, not really seeming to grasp what he was saying, and when he sparked the lighter, we all took a cautious step back. "I'm going to light this. That should give you about," he thought about it, "a minute before it goes off. In that minute, I would suggest you jump into the back of the truck as quickly as you can, before—" But he needn't have bothered. 8 men, Boswick included, started running for the truck, and all of them piled in as Dewey ran for the cab. Your dad and I, however, ran in the opposite direction, not wanting any part of this. A year's pay wasn't worth what they were about to do. Your dad and I started running before the truck even squealed off, and it was a good thing we did. Those barrels went up about 30 seconds later, and the blast threw both of us 10 feet, even at the distance that we had run. The concussion was like a mortar shell, the heat immediate and intense, and when I picked my head up, shaking it, there was fire in the forest. It was huge, lots of black smoke, and I was struggling to my feet when your dad grabbed me under the arm and hoisted me up. "Run! For the love of God, run!" So we ran. It didn't take them long to find us. The mist came first, like it always does. We were running flat out, really hoofing it, when I saw something from the corner of my eye and yelled for your dad to stop. I think he'd have just kept going otherwise, and you'd have more than one reason to be pissed at those woodland bastards. I had to yell twice, little as I wanted them to hear me, and on the second yell, he froze in place. We didn't have time to sit. We didn't have time to do anything. We just stood there, still as statues, and watched the foresters come. I had seen them before, but never like this. Until then, I'd seen a dozen at a time, but there were at least 50 of them, moving through the woods. They groaned as they walked, like trees in a high wind, and I was afraid they were going to bump into us and find us there. They don't have eyes. Did you know that? They got close enough that I could see that. Their feet sank into the ground, the roots pushing into the ground as they walked. Maybe that's how they find things, through the vibrations on the ground, but at that moment, we were both just trying to remain as still as possible. They turned after a little, more interested in the fire than new converts. They took the mist with them, and when they went, we ran. We ran and ran, neither of us realizing how deep in the woods we'd gone. And just as the sun began to dip, we made it back to the yard. Mr. Camber, the one who owned it when we started, asked us what had happened, and we spelled it out for him. They took trucks in the next day to pick up survivors, but there was no one. The dually was found near the edge of the deep woods, the border between the foresters' territory and ours, all smashed and wrecked. There wasn't a window unbroken or a piece of metal undented. None of the lumbermen were ever seen again, the mayor either, and an emergency election had to be held. The next mayor made it clear that he would uphold the old ways, and no one ever tried to fight the foresters again. Your dad and I were given a couple of weeks off, and then we got back, and I requested placement on a crew that didn't go to the deep woods. I never wanted to see that place again, though it would still play in my dreams from time to time. That was 15 years ago, but I still wake up with nightmares of that army of foresters sometimes. Garza lay back on his pillows, staring out the window as he pondered whether he had been right to tell it or not. That is the last I will speak of it, and I never want to hear about it again. Go on. I'm tired. I left then, understanding now why Terry had wanted the story so badly, though I didn't even think he really knew why. The information here was a game changer.